I am Leland Cole. I am 70 years old and I recently orchestrated the complete destruction of my own children. I went on a luxury Caribbean cruise with my two sons, Deon and Corey, believing it was a peaceful family vacation to celebrate my retirement. At our second port of call in Nassau, they suggested I step off the ship to check out the local market for souvenirs. When I returned to the dock, the massive ship was already pulling away. My sons stood up on the 12th deck looking down at me. Deon was holding my brown leather briefcase. That briefcase contained my primary passport, my wallet, and my daily heart medication. They thought they had just stranded a helpless, senile old man to die in a foreign country, so they could legally steal my corporate empire back in Atlanta. They were entirely wrong. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their privileged lives on national television, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe greedy, ungrateful children need to learn a brutal lesson in reality. Growing up poor taught me how to survive. Growing rich taught me how to hide my weapons. My sons only knew the wealth, and they assumed my silence meant I was weak. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson. The brutal heat of the Nassau concrete baked straight through the thin leather soles of my loafers. I stood entirely still by the edge of the water. The salty ocean breeze hit my face as I watched the massive white hull of the ocean liner slowly detach from the dock. The ship horn blasted loudly, a deep resonating sound that vibrated right through my chest. Up on the top deck, I could clearly see Deon and Corey leaning casually against the gleaming white railing. Deon raised his right hand with a smug, victorious smile on his face. He held up my vintage brown leather briefcase for me to see. Corey laughed out loud and patted his older brother heavily on the shoulder. They were absolutely certain they had just solved their biggest financial problem. They believed I would wander the dangerous streets of the Bahamas confused and alone until my fragile heart finally gave out. Or perhaps they thought I would be locked away in a chaotic, unfamiliar hospital ward as a nameless patient without any identification. I did not wave my arms in panic. I did not shout for the captain to stop the vessel. I simply kept my cold, calculating gaze locked directly on them until their smiling faces became nothing but tiny blurs in the ocean distance. The trap was set and they had walked right into it voluntarily. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. As soon as the cruise ship was fully out of shouting distance, I knew I had to play my part perfectly. A local Port Authority officer in a crisp white uniform noticed me standing alone near the mooring lines. He began walking toward me, looking highly suspicious of an elderly man lingering near the water with no luggage and no family in sight. I instantly slumped my shoulders forward. I let my hands tremble violently at my sides. I widened my eyes to mimic the deep, hollow confusion of advanced dementia. When the officer approached and asked if I needed any assistance, I stuttered my words purposely. I told him in a frail, cracked voice that I had lost my two boys. I patted my empty pockets in a frantic, uncoordinated rhythm. I walked in a small, confused circle, ensuring all the surrounding tourists saw a helpless, senile grandfather who had been tragically left behind by his family. The officer's stern expression immediately softened into deep pity. He placed a gentle, guiding hand on my shoulder and led me away from the harsh sun toward the shaded terminal seating area. He handed me a clear plastic cup of ice water. I grasped the thin plastic with both hands, purposely letting my fingers shake so violently that freezing water spilled down the front of my shirt. Internally, my mind was operating like a cold, calculating machine. I was counting the exact seconds and minutes. I needed to wait precisely 25 minutes to ensure the cruise ship was officially in international waters. Once they crossed that line, maritime law dictated the captain could not simply turn the massive ship around without a massive logistical nightmare and severe financial penalties. I listened closely as the officer radioed his supervisor about a confused American tourist stranded at the terminal. I nodded vacantly when a kind female tourist offered me a paper tissue to dry my shirt. I let them treat me like a fragile, broken child. I had to make sure no local authorities tried to contact the cruise line immediately. If the captain turned the ship around now, Deon and Corey would simply pretend it was a tragic accident. They would claim I wandered off while they were buying drinks at the bar. I needed their act of abandonment to be final, irreversible, and entirely documented by the port authorities as a deliberate act. I sat quietly on that cold metal bench, taking slow, deliberate breaths. I watched the large analog clock on the terminal wall tick past the 25-minute mark. The steel jaws of my trap had officially snapped shut. They had committed the ultimate crime of elder abandonment. Now they had to face the execution of my revenge. My sons always completely underestimated the blood, the sweat, and the absolute ruthlessness it took to build Cole Logistics from the ground up. I transformed a single rusted delivery truck into a billion-dollar logistics empire spanning the entire East Coast of the United States. I am a self-made man who grew up with absolutely nothing in the segregated, impoverished neighborhoods of Atlanta. Every single dollar I earned was paid for in exhausted nights and dangerous financial risks. Deon and Corey were born into silk sheets and unearned privilege. They attended elite private boarding schools and drove imported European sports cars before they ever held a real job. 6 months ago, I noticed severe financial discrepancies in the corporate ledger. Millions of dollars were being quietly funneled into offshore shell companies tied to my 2 daughters-in-law. Instead of confronting my sons in a boardroom, I began to perform a very specific, carefully crafted character. I started forgetting important client names at board meetings. I purposely left the stove on at the family estate. I asked the exact same questions twice during Sunday family dinners. I wanted to see exactly what my own flesh and blood would do when they believed the king of the empire was losing his mind. I gave them enough rope to hang themselves. I wanted to see if they would step up and protect their aging father, or if they would plot in the shadows to steal my throne. They eagerly chose the path of thieves. This entire luxury cruise was their master plan to physically isolate me, steal my identification, and file an emergency motion of medical incompetence back in Georgia to seize total control of my life and my assets. The Port Authority officer finally turned his back for just a moment to speak with the terminal manager. I immediately sat up perfectly straight. The pathetic trembling in my hands vanished completely. My posture corrected itself into the rigid, intimidating spine of a chief executive officer. I reached down to my right leather loafer. I pressed my thumb hard against the heel and slid back a custom hidden compartment. I pulled out my secondary, fully valid federal passport and a black titanium American Express card. I did not need the critical heart medication in the stolen briefcase. Those pills were nothing but cheap breath mints I had swapped into a prescription bottle weeks ago. My physical heart was perfectly fine. My emotional heart, however, had turned to pure ice. I stood up and walked briskly out the side exit of the terminal, leaving the bewildered officer searching the room for me. I stepped out into the blazing Bahamian sun near the private vehicle pickup lane. A sleek, armored black Maybach glided to a halt precisely in front of me. The tinted rear window rolled down smoothly. Inside sat my ruthless corporate attorney, Mr. Rosenberg. He held an encrypted satellite phone in his right hand. He looked at me respectfully and stated that the international banking executives were waiting on the secure line for my direct command. I climbed into the cool, air-conditioned leather seat and closed the heavy armored door behind me. The real game had just begun. My ignorant sons were currently drinking champagne on a boat, celebrating a victory they had not won. They had absolutely no idea they were already losing everything. The air conditioning inside the unmarked glass building in the Nassau financial district was freezing cold. It was a sharp and welcome contrast to the brutal island heat I had just escaped. Mr. Rosenberg walked beside me with focused determination. He escorted me past the heavily armed security guards and directly into a private, soundproof VIP suite reserved exclusively for top-tier offshore clients. A sleek mahogany desk sat in the center of the spacious room. It held nothing but a high-performance computer terminal and a secure satellite phone. I sat down in the heavy leather chair and cracked my knuckles. My sons assumed my technological capabilities peaked with sending a simple text message. They had absolutely no idea that I had personally funded and overseen the development of the Cole Logistics proprietary cybersecurity network. I pulled the keyboard close and typed in my master override sequence. It was a string of codes only the founder possessed. The screen flashed bright green, granting me absolute and undetected access to the entire corporate server located back in Atlanta. I effortlessly bypassed the expensive dual authentication protocols Deon had proudly installed just last month. I was now deep inside the digital heart of my empire, completely invisible to the IT department. My eyes quickly scanned the live data streams. I was looking for the specific financial anomalies I knew Deon would try to execute the moment he thought I was incapacitated. It did not take long to find the poison running through my company's veins. Right there on the glowing screen, a massive and unauthorized wire transfer was sitting heavily in the pending queue. The amount was exactly $50 million in liquid corporate cash. It was the specific emergency reserve fund I had meticulously set aside for our global shipping insurance premiums. Deon was attempting to drain the absolute lifeblood of Cole Logistics while he sat on a luxury cruise ship drinking margaritas. I pulled up the routing details to track the money. He was moving the massive amount of capital through a highly complex web of 3 different international banks. He was trying to wash the transaction before it landed in its final destination to avoid federal scrutiny. But I had the master clearance required to trace the terminal account. The final destination was a newly registered shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. I opened the encrypted corporate registry documents attached to that specific account. The primary beneficiary and sole signatory of that offshore shell was not Deon. It was his white wife, Megan. The sheer audacity of the betrayal made my jaw tighten in anger. Deon was not just stealing from his own father and jeopardizing thousands of employees. He was handing the stolen fortune directly to a woman who had spent the last decade complaining about the color of my skin and the volume of my voice at our Sunday family dinners. Megan had clearly manipulated my arrogant and weak-minded son into securing her personal financial independence before the ink on my supposed death certificate was even dry. They had planned this digital heist down to the very minute. The transfer was set to clear the final automated security check in less than 10 minutes. Deon probably timed it perfectly so the money would vanish while he was safely in international waters. That would give him the perfect legal alibi. He would return to Atlanta, shed a few fake tears over his missing father, and declare the logistics company bankrupt due to unforeseen market forces. Meanwhile, his wife would be sitting on $50 million of untraceable stolen wealth. I watched the green progress bar on the screen slowly filling up. The transaction was 90% complete. The banking system was waiting for one final digital handshake to release the funds permanently. If I simply hit the cancel button, the money would stay safely in the corporate account. Deon would receive a failed transaction alert on his phone. He would panic momentarily, but he would still retain his corporate power and try again later. Canceling the theft was not a punishment at all. It was just a temporary delay. I needed to ensure that this stolen money was weaponized against them permanently. I needed to trap Deon in a financial nightmare of his own making from which he could never wake up. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. Deon always believed he was the smartest man in the room simply because he held an expensive business degree from an elite Ivy League university. He constantly looked down on me because my hands were permanently calloused and I did not use fancy corporate buzzwords during board meetings. He conveniently forgot that 50 years ago I started this entire logistics empire with one single rusted delivery truck. I drove that miserable truck through the freezing winter rain and the blistering summer heat. I slept in dangerous truck stop parking lots and ate cold soup straight from a tin can because I could not afford a cheap motel room. I bled to build the solid foundation of the massive wealth he was currently trying to steal with a few keystrokes. Deon never unloaded a single heavy cargo crate in his life. He never negotiated with angry union workers on a freezing loading dock at 3 a.m. His entire existence was a carefully curated luxury experience paid for entirely by my sweat and sacrifice. He wore imported designer suits and spoke with arrogant authority, genuinely believing the massive company practically ran itself. He thought I was just an uneducated, lucky relic of the past who got swept up in the commercial transport boom. He truly believed my aging mind was far too slow to understand the mechanics of modern digital finance. That supreme arrogant assumption was exactly what I was about to use to absolutely destroy his life. I placed my hands back on the keyboard. I absolutely did not click the cancel button. Instead, I activated the Supreme Executive Reroute Protocol built deep into the system code. The banking software prompted me to enter a new destination routing number for the $50 million. I typed in the exact offshore account coordinates for the Sylvia Cole Charitable Trust. It was an ironclad philanthropic foundation I had quietly set up in honor of my late wife. It was designed exclusively to fund pediatric hospitals and educational programs in underprivileged African American neighborhoods. I took a deep breath and hit the enter key. The screen flashed a brilliant blue. The system verified the new routing numbers and entirely bypassed Deon's original Cayman Islands instructions. I watched with immense satisfaction as the progress bar hit 100%. The massive transaction cleared. The funds were instantly and legally transferred out of Cole Logistics and locked securely into the charity. It was a completely one-way street. International philanthropic trust laws made it absolutely impossible to reverse the transfer without a decade of intense federal litigation. Deon's stolen money had legally vanished into thin air. It was transformed into an irreversible charitable donation that would help thousands of children. I logged out of the terminal and stood up from the desk. Mr. Rosenberg handed me a fresh cup of black coffee and smiled grimly. Back on the luxury cruise ship, Deon had just received an automated text message confirming his $50 million transaction was successful. He was undoubtedly celebrating with another expensive drink, completely unaware that his wife's secret bank account was still empty. But that was only the beginning of his nightmare. I turned to Mr. Rosenberg and told him it was time to make the phone call to the national television networks. While I was stepping into a private jet chartered for New York, my sons were completely engulfed in their own delusional victory. I later purchased the high-definition security footage from the cruise line, allowing me to watch their exact downfall frame by frame. The VIP lounge on the 12th deck of the ship was an exclusive sanctuary of velvet booths and panoramic ocean views. Deon and Corey sat in the absolute center of the room, acting like conquering kings. The heavy crystal glasses on their table were filled with a rare vintage champagne that cost $5,000 a bottle. Corey leaned back against the plush cushions, laughing loudly with a thick cigar clamped between his teeth. Deon held his phone up to the light, proudly showing his younger brother the automated text message confirming a $50 million transfer. He actually believed the money was safely resting in his wife's Cayman Islands account. They clinked their glasses together in a loud, obnoxious toast to their newfound total control. They were celebrating the successful execution of their own father. The arrogance radiating from them was sickening. They openly joked about my supposed demise, completely unbothered by the fact that they had just abandoned their 70-year-old father in a foreign port. Corey laughed so hard he spilled champagne on his designer shirt. He loudly called me dead weight. He told Deon that the old dinosaur was probably begging for loose change outside a Nassau tourist shop right at that very moment. They began planning the immediate dismantling of my life's work. Deon bragged about how he was going to fire all the senior logistics managers the second he returned to Atlanta. He wanted to replace my loyal, hardworking executives with his inexperienced frat brothers. Corey was already browsing real estate websites on his tablet, looking for a massive new penthouse in Miami to buy with his stolen share of the company. They were so intoxicated by their perceived power that they decided to buy a round of drinks for the entire VIP lounge. Deon snapped his fingers at the bartender, a highly disrespectful gesture he had learned from his gold-digging wife. He ordered 3 more bottles of the $5,000 champagne and a large platter of imported beluga caviar. He wanted everyone in the room to know he was the wealthiest man on the ocean. When the bartender respectfully presented the massive leather-bound check, Deon did not even glance at the total. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his heavy metal corporate credit card. He tossed it onto the silver tray with a smug smirk, telling the bartender to keep the change. He truly believed that piece of metal was a magic wand that would forever fund his reckless existence. My sons had never understood the actual value of a dollar because they had never been forced to earn one. Their entire history was a pathetic string of expensive failures and reckless spending. When Deon was 25, he demanded $2 million to start a luxury concierge application. He spent the entire budget on lavish launch parties and private jets before the software was even coded. When the company inevitably filed for bankruptcy, I quietly absorbed the loss and paid off his angry investors to keep his name out of the business papers. Corey was even worse. He treated the Cole Logistics corporate accounts like his personal casino. I had personally wired hundreds of thousands of dollars to private security firms to cover up his drunken sports car crashes and massive underground gambling debts. They never built a single profitable thing in their entire miserable lives. They were professional parasites. They only knew how to extract resources from the massive tree I had planted, watered, and protected with my own blood. I had shielded them from the brutal consequences of their actions for decades, because I mistakenly believed my financial protection equaled fatherly love. I realized too late that my constant bailouts had completely destroyed their character. By handing them the world on a silver platter, I had raised 2 entitled predators who eventually decided to eat the hand that fed them. The bartender picked up the silver tray and walked over to the point-of-sale terminal behind the mahogany bar. At that exact moment, the scheduled programming on the massive flat-screen televisions surrounding the VIP lounge was abruptly interrupted. The screens flashed bright red with the CNBC breaking news logo. The volume in the lounge automatically increased. Deon and Corey stopped laughing. Their smiles instantly vanished as my face appeared on every single screen in the room. I was not wandering the streets of the Bahamas. I was standing live in a major broadcasting studio directly on Wall Street, wearing my sharpest tailored suit and looking directly into the camera lens. I calmly announced to the global financial markets that I was immediately freezing all operations and assets of Cole Logistics due to massive, undeniable internal fraud perpetrated by the acting co-chief executive officers. I stated their names clearly for the entire world to hear. I announced that the authorities had been fully notified and an international federal investigation was already underway. The color completely drained from Deon's face. He dropped his expensive cigar directly onto his trousers. Corey stared at the television screens with his mouth hanging wide open in pure terror. Before either of them could even formulate a single word, the bartender returned to their table. He did not look impressed anymore. He looked highly annoyed. He dropped the heavy metal corporate card back onto the table. He leaned in close and delivered the very first consequence of their new reality. He stated clearly and loudly that the card was declined. The bartender's words hung in the cold air, conditioned air of the VIP lounge like a physical blow to the stomach. Declined. Deon snatched the heavy metal corporate card back from the silver tray, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He immediately accused the bartender of using a faulty point-of-sale machine. He aggressively reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out his personal platinum Visa card. He slammed it onto the polished mahogany counter, loudly demanding the transaction be run again immediately. The bartender remained entirely stoic and swiped the card in silence. The machine beeped a sharp, high-pitched error tone. Declined again. Absolute panic began to flicker behind Deon's wide eyes. He frantically dug into his designer leather wallet, pulling out every single piece of plastic he owned. Visa, MasterCard, Premium, American Express. One by one, the bartender swiped them. One by one, the machine rejected them all with that same mocking error tone. Corey quickly pulled out his own wallet, his hands visibly trembling as he handed over his exclusive black card. He insisted his account had a limitless ceiling. The result was exactly the same. The screen flashed red. Every single line of credit, both corporate and personal, had been completely and surgically severed. The realization crashed over them simultaneously like a tidal wave. My live broadcast on the television screens above was not just an empty corporate threat to scare them. I had completely cut their financial lifelines with absolute devastating precision. They were entirely cut off from the world. Deon completely abandoned his $5,000 champagne and frantically pulled out his mobile phone. He desperately needed to call his aggressive legal team back in Atlanta to reverse whatever freeze I had initiated. But the top corner of his phone screen displayed no service. They were in the middle of the ocean, hundreds of miles away from any cellular communications tower. He quickly navigated to the cruise ship's internal digital portal to purchase the premium satellite internet package. The screen prompted him for an immediate digital payment. He typed in his primary card numbers with shaking, uncoordinated fingers, hitting the submit button with aggressive force. The screen flashed a red error message indicating insufficient funds and a locked account status. He tried Corey's cards. Blocked. He even tried entering Megan's supposedly flush Cayman Islands account details from memory. Invalid. Deon slammed his expensive phone onto the glass table, cracking the screen instantly. His breathing grew incredibly heavy and erratic. He stormed over to the main concierge desk of the VIP lounge, demanding immediate access to the ship's secure communications array. A senior hospitality manager wearing a pristine white uniform with gold epaulets stepped forward to safely intercept him. The manager calmly and professionally explained that internet access required a valid payment method on file. Because their primary cabin folio was currently showing a massive negative balance from the exorbitant bar tab they just racked up, no further amenities could possibly be authorized until the debt was settled in cash. That calm, polite refusal completely broke whatever fragile shred of sanity Deon had left. He leaned violently over the marble counter, spit flying from his mouth as he screamed directly into the manager's face. He bellowed that he was the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar global logistics company and demanded to use the captain's private satellite phone right this second. When the manager firmly instructed Deon to lower his voice and step back from the desk, Deon lost all rational control. He lunged forward, grabbed the manager by the lapels of his crisp white jacket, and violently shoved him backward. The manager stumbled hard and crashed into a massive decorative display of expensive liquor bottles, sending glass and premium alcohol shattering violently across the polished wooden floor. Corey jumped up from the velvet booth not to restrain his out-of-control brother but to aggressively join the chaos. Corey began cursing loudly at the surrounding passengers, threatening to buy the entire cruise line just to fire every single employee on board. They were acting exactly like wild animals trapped in a cage they could no longer buy their way out of. The other wealthy patrons in the lounge recoiled in absolute disgust, pulling their wives away from the violent, pathetic spectacle. Deon stood over the fallen manager, clenching his fists and demanding total obedience, completely blind to the severe reality of his new situation. For their entire adult lives, my two sons had operated under the absolute unwavering certainty that their immense wealth was a magical shield against all earthly consequences. When Deon brutally assaulted a valet driver outside a luxury nightclub in Miami 5 years ago, my corporate fixers arrived with briefcases full of cash to silence the victim and bury the police report before the sun even came up. When Corey completely trashed a rented penthouse suite in Las Vegas during a drug-fueled weekend, destroying priceless art in the process, a simple wire transfer from my accounts made the hotel management look the other way and drop all charges. They had never once experienced the harsh sting of accountability. My money had smoothed over every rough edge of their horrible personalities, transforming their actual criminal behavior into minor, easily dismissed eccentricities. They genuinely believed the rules of civilized society simply did not apply to men in tailored suits with endless credit limits. But right now, standing in the middle of a cruise ship in international waters, the brutal reality of their existence was completely laid bare. Stripped of my powerful name, my corporate influence, and my bank accounts, they were absolutely nothing. They were no longer untouchable titans of industry who commanded respect. They were just two angry, out-of-control, entitled men throwing a pathetic temper tantrum on a boat. The grand illusion of their inherent superiority had been instantly vaporized by a single declined transaction at a bar. They possessed no real power, no actual authority, and no inherent respect from anyone. Without my money to artificially elevate them above the law, they immediately resorted to base animalistic violence, proving to everyone in that luxurious room exactly what kind of weak men they truly were beneath the expensive clothing. The deafening sound of shattering glass and Deon's unhinged screaming triggered a silent emergency alarm behind the concierge desk. Within 60 seconds, the heavy double doors of the VIP lounge swung violently open. 4 massive maritime security officers, clad in tactical black uniforms and carrying heavy batons, rushed into the room. Deon immediately turned his misplaced aggression toward them, pointing a trembling finger and ordering the heavily armed guards to arrest the bleeding hospitality manager on the floor. The lead security officer ignored Deon completely. He took one look at the injured manager, the dangerous broken glass covering the floor, and the highly aggressive posture of my two sons. Maritime law is incredibly strict and entirely unforgiving. The captain of a vessel is the absolute legal authority in international waters, and acts of physical violence against the crew are treated as severe federal offenses. The officers moved in with ruthless, practiced efficiency. Deon tried to throw a wild punch at the closest guard, but his arm was instantly grabbed and twisted painfully behind his back. Corey cowardly tried to run for the exit, but a massive guard tackled him straight into a velvet sofa, pinning his face to the cushions. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the suddenly silent lounge. The other wealthy passengers watched in stunned, quiet fascination as Deon and Corey were forcefully dragged out of the beautiful room, aggressively kicking and screaming frantic obscenities. Because of the physical assault on a crew member, the severe destruction of ship property, and the massive unpaid bar folio, the captain revoked all their passenger privileges instantly. They were not escorted back to their massive luxury suite to pack their bags. They were dragged deep into the windowless, freezing bowels of the massive ship and thrown directly into the steel brig. They were now securely locked in a tiny, cold metal cage for the remainder of the voyage, with absolutely no money, no outside communication, and no escape. While my sons were trading their $5,000 champagne for a freezing steel cage at the bottom of the ocean, I was already moving on to the next phase of my absolute dismantling of their lives. I boarded a private Gulfstream jet chartered directly for Atlanta. The flight was incredibly smooth and completely silent. It gave me ample time to prepare for the final cleansing of my own home. My driver picked me up right on the private tarmac and drove me straight to the massive wrought iron gates of the Cole estate. It was a sprawling property sitting on 12 pristine acres of Georgia real estate. I did not ring the bell or alert the security staff to my arrival. I used my master key to unlock the massive mahogany front doors and stepped quietly into the grand foyer. The house was not empty. It was vibrating with the heavy bass of loud music echoing from the backyard patio. My daughters-in-law Megan and Abigail wasted absolutely no time celebrating their supposed inheritance. They thought I was either dead or wandering hopelessly lost in the Caribbean. They had no idea the grim reaper of their financial existence had just walked right through the front door. I walked slowly through the long marble hallway, leading toward the massive glass doors of the back patio. The sheer level of disrespect happening inside my own home was staggering. Megan and Abigail had invited dozens of their shallow, wealthy friends over for a lavish midday pool party. Caterers in crisp white uniforms were walking around carrying trays of expensive cocktails and imported hors d'oeuvres. But the loud music and the arrogant laughter were not the things that made my blood boil. It was what I saw happening in the formal dining room. They had hired a team of private estate liquidators who were actively boxing up my late wife Sylvia's most precious belongings. I stood in the doorway and watched as a stranger casually wrapped Sylvia's antique silver tea set in cheap bubble wrap. Next to the silver was a towering stack of her original oil paintings, all tagged with bright neon auction stickers. Megan and Abigail were not just celebrating my demise. They were actively erasing Sylvia's memory from the house to quickly generate cash for their own selfish desires. I pushed the heavy glass patio doors open. The loud music was instantly deafening. Megan was standing near the edge of the heated pool wearing a designer swimsuit and holding a crystal margarita glass. Abigail was right next to her, laughing loudly at some terrible joke while directing a caterer to open another bottle of tequila. I did not yell. I simply walked over to the outdoor sound system and pulled the main power cord directly out of the wall socket. The heavy bass instantly died. The sudden shocking silence caused everyone in the yard to turn around simultaneously. Megan turned around with a furious expression, ready to scream at whichever servant dared to interrupt her party. Her mouth fell wide open. The crystal margarita glass slipped right through her perfectly manicured fingers and shattered into 100 pieces on the expensive stone deck. Abigail physically stumbled backward, her face turning completely pale as if she had just seen a ghost. The entire crowd of their wealthy, parasitic friends fell entirely silent. They stared at me standing there in my tailored suit, looking absolutely nothing like the frail, dementia-ridden old man my sons had undoubtedly described to them. Megan's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless stutter escaped her lips. Abigail instinctively grabbed the edge of a patio chair to keep herself from falling over. They were paralyzed with absolute terror. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The crowd of party guests instinctively parted like the Red Sea, backing away from me in sheer panic. Several of them recognized me from the live television broadcast that had undoubtedly just aired on the news channels. They knew exactly what was happening, and they wanted no part of my wrath. I walked right past the terrified guests and stepped up to the outdoor marble bar where Megan and Abigail were standing frozen. I looked down at the auction inventory list Megan had left sitting on the counter. She had priced Sylvia's vintage grand piano at a fraction of its true value just to sell it quickly. My calm demeanor terrified them far more than any violent screaming ever could. This sickening display of greed was entirely consistent with exactly who these two women truly were. Megan and Abigail never loved Deon and Corey. They only loved the immense gravity of the Cole fortune. From the very first day they married into my family, they made it incredibly obvious how much they despised our proud African-American heritage. They constantly complained about the traditional soul food recipes Sylvia cooked for Thanksgiving, calling the meals too heavy and unsophisticated for their refined palates. They quietly removed the beautiful, culturally significant artwork Sylvia had purchased from local black artists, replacing the pieces with sterile, modern, abstract paintings that possessed absolutely no soul. They were gold diggers of the highest order women who viewed my family as nothing more than a highly profitable stepping stone. They tolerated my sons only because my sons provided them with unlimited credit limits and access to elite social circles. They had spent the last decade rolling their eyes at me behind my back, mocking my southern accent, and impatiently waiting for me to die so they could completely whitewash the Cole legacy. They thought by boxing up Sylvia's antiques today, they were finally erasing the last stubborn stain of the people who actually built this empire. They grossly underestimated how fiercely I protect what belongs to me. I remembered the day Sylvia specifically chose that antique silver tea set. We had just signed our very first $1 million contract. She cried tears of pure joy telling me that our grandchildren would one day inherit the silver and know the exact story of our struggle and our ultimate triumph. Megan and Abigail wanted to sell that beautiful history for pocket change to buy more designer handbags. Their absolute lack of respect for the foundation of this family was a disease, and I was the absolute cure. I did not waste my breath shouting at them. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a single neatly folded legal document. I slammed it down flat onto the wet marble counter right in front of Megan. It was a formal court-ordered eviction notice stamped with the red seal of a federal judge. Megan stared down at the paper, her eyes darting back and forth as she frantically tried to comprehend the complex legal jargon. She looked up at me with tears of pure panic welling in her eyes, loudly claiming that this was her primary residence and she possessed legal marital rights to the property. I leaned in close, ensuring every single terrified guest heard my exact words. I informed her that this massive estate was never actually placed into the family trust. It remained entirely under my sole personal ownership, and I had legally sold the entire property to a commercial demolition company 3 days ago. The bulldozers were already scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning at exactly 6 o'clock to tear the entire mansion down to the dirt. I pointed a steady finger toward the front gates. I told Megan and Abigail they had exactly 1 hour to pack whatever clothes they could carry in their bare hands and vacate my property permanently. Any item left behind, including their luxury cars parked in the driveway, would be completely crushed by the heavy machinery. The party was officially over. As if on cue, the heavy sound of a massive diesel engine rumbled from the front of the property. A flatbed truck carrying a giant yellow bulldozer had just parked right outside the wrought iron gates waiting for my signal. Megan dropped to her knees on the wet stone and let out a pathetic, high-pitched sob. Megan's pathetic sobs on the wet marble deck did not last long. The heavy rumble of the diesel bulldozer idling right outside the front gates snapped her out of her shock and ignited her deeply ingrained entitlement. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking violently as she grabbed her expensive smartphone from the outdoor bar. She completely ignored the eviction notice lying right in front of her. Instead, she aggressively dialed 911. She paced frantically back and forth along the edge of the swimming pool, shooting venomous glares in my direction. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Megan immediately activated her most desperate, hysterical voice. She screamed into the receiver that a dangerous, mentally unstable man had just broken into her private estate. She claimed I was violently threatening her guests and raving about destroying the house. She purposely left out the fact that I was her father-in-law and the actual owner of the property. She begged the police to send armed units immediately, insisting her life was in imminent danger. She hung up the phone and crossed her arms, a triumphant, malicious smirk temporarily replacing her terror as she glared at me. Less than 5 minutes later, the wailing sound of multiple police sirens pierced the quiet atmosphere of the upscale neighborhood. 3 local police cruisers aggressively pulled into the circular driveway, their red and blue lights flashing brightly against the massive columns of the house. 4 officers jumped out of their vehicles with their hands resting cautiously on their duty weapons. They rushed through the open front doors and out onto the back patio, scanning the terrified crowd of party guests for an active threat. Megan immediately rushed toward the lead officer. She expertly squeezed a fresh stream of tears from her eyes, playing the role of the fragile, terrified victim flawlessly. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, sobbing loudly as she claimed I had violently forced my way into her home and terrorized her friends. She demanded they arrest me immediately and drag me away in handcuffs. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man, turned his stern gaze toward me and commanded me to step away from the bar and keep my hands completely visible. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with the screaming woman. I calmly picked up a porcelain teacup from one of the catering trays, took a slow sip of the cold chamomile tea, and smiled politely at the officer. I reached inside my tailored suit jacket, moving deliberately and smoothly to avoid startling the armed men. I pulled out a thick, legally binding folder and placed it gently on the marble counter next to the eviction notice. I informed the officer in a steady, authoritative tone that there was a massive misunderstanding. I explained that I was Leland Cole, the sole owner of the estate, and the hysterical woman screaming at them was my estranged daughter-in-law who was currently trespassing. The officer looked confused and stepped forward to examine the documents. He picked up the folder and meticulously reviewed the certified property deeds, the official sale contract to the demolition company, and the judge-ordered eviction mandate. His stern expression shifted from aggressive suspicion to uncomfortable realization. He looked back and forth between the ironclad legal documents and Megan's tear-stained face. The paperwork was absolutely flawless, stamped and verified by the city courts just 48 hours prior. The officer handed the folder back to me with a respectful nod. He turned his body toward Megan, his tone now completely devoid of any sympathy. He informed her that this was a civil matter regarding a lawful eviction, and that she had absolutely no legal right to remain on the premises. He ordered her to pack her belongings immediately and vacate the property before he was forced to arrest her for criminal trespassing. Megan's jaw dropped. Her ultimate weapon had completely failed. The guests began whispering frantically, rushing toward the front doors to escape the humiliating scene before they were implicated. Megan tried to argue, raising her voice to a shrill pitch, threatening to have the officer fired by calling the mayor. This pathetic display of weaponized fragility was exactly how Megan had controlled my son Deon for their entire 10-year marriage. She was an absolute master at playing the victim to manipulate the men around her into doing her bidding. Whenever Deon attempted to establish a boundary or question her absurd credit card bills, Megan would instantly turn on the waterworks. She would claim he was emotionally abusive, using her tears to completely disarm his weak willpower. She used her status as a wealthy, delicate society wife as an impenetrable shield against any form of accountability. If a restaurant host made them wait 5 minutes for a table, she cried until the manager fired the employee. If a contractor made a minor mistake on a home renovation, she threatened devastating lawsuits while sobbing to the local news stations. Deon was too cowardly to ever stand up to her dramatic outbursts, so he simply surrendered his authority and allowed her to dictate their entire existence. She had built her entire luxurious life on the foundational lie that the world constantly owed her an apology. But today her fake tears were falling on completely barren soil. I was not my spineless son, and I possessed absolutely no sympathy for a parasite who had actively tried to steal my empire and erase my beloved wife's memory. Her manipulative tactics were utterly useless against a man armed with cold, hard facts and relentless determination. She had fundamentally misunderstood the power dynamic in this family. She believed her manufactured distress could override legal contracts and my decades of accumulated authority. She genuinely thought her performance could bend the police to her will, just as it had bent Deon into a submissive accomplice. She was about to learn that outside the protective bubble of my wealth, her tears held absolutely no currency. Megan continued to scream at the local police officer, stomping her foot on the deck and demanding he call his supervisor. Before the officer could warn her about stepping into handcuffs, the heavy glass doors of the patio swung open once again. The local police officers immediately stepped back and created a wide path. 4 men wearing dark suits and blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their backs walked onto the patio. They moved with a terrifying, silent authority that instantly silenced Megan's shrill screaming. The lead federal agent did not look at me. He walked directly toward Megan, pulling a folded document from his jacket. Megan instinctively took a step back, her manufactured anger instantly replaced by genuine bone-chilling terror. She looked wildly toward Abigail, who was already sprinting toward the side gate to save herself. The federal agent held up the document and stated Megan's full legal name. He announced that he held a federal search and seizure warrant authorized by the United States Department of Justice. He declared that they were not there to assist with the eviction. They were there to immediately seize her personal laptops, her mobile devices, and every piece of jewelry currently located on the premises. He explicitly stated the seizure was part of an active, ongoing investigation into a $50 million international wire fraud conspiracy. Megan's knees buckled. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The secret Cayman Islands account had just become her prison sentence. The agent signaled to his team, and they immediately began marching toward the master bedroom to tear her luxurious sanctuary apart. The trap I set in the offshore bank had just arrived at her front door. While the federal agents were meticulously tearing apart my daughter-in-law's luxurious bedroom in Atlanta, my 2 sons were finally experiencing the harsh reality of their own consequences hundreds of miles away. The massive luxury cruise ship slowly pulled into the bustling port of Miami under a sweltering afternoon sun. Deon and Corey did not get to disembark walking down the grand staircase to the cheers of the crew. Instead, they were forcefully escorted down a hidden service ramp by 4 heavily armed maritime security guards. They were both wearing the exact same expensive resort clothes they had worn in the VIP lounge several days ago. Those once pristine designer shirts were now deeply wrinkled, stained with dried sweat and reeking of the damp, windowless steel brig where they had been locked away. As soon as their expensive leather shoes hit the concrete dock, the lead security officer handed them a single manila envelope containing their passports and unceremoniously ordered them to never attempt to board another vessel owned by the corporation. They stood completely frozen on the sun-baked pavement, squinting blindly in the harsh light, entirely stripped of their dignity and their power. The immediate reality of their situation crashed down on them the moment they tried to hail a taxi to the airport. Deon aggressively waved down a passing yellow cab, pulling open the door and barking an authoritative order to be taken to the nearest private aviation terminal. The driver took one look at their disheveled, unwashed appearance and immediately demanded cash up front. Deon frantically patted his pockets, remembering with a sickening jolt that every single credit card he owned was completely deactivated and securely locked in his wallet. He had absolutely zero physical currency. Corey pulled out his mobile phone to call his executive assistant in Atlanta, only to find the screen completely black and the battery entirely dead. Deon had smashed his own phone during his violent temper tantrum in the VIP lounge. They possessed no communication devices, no access to their massive bank accounts, and absolutely no way to instantly solve their problem with a simple wire transfer. The taxi driver angrily cursed at them for wasting his time and sped away, leaving them choking on a cloud of hot exhaust fumes. They were stranded in a massive, unforgiving city. For the first time in their sheltered lives, they had to walk for several miles under the blistering Florida sun. Their expensive, sockless leather loafers brutally blistered their soft heels until they finally reached a run-down commercial bus terminal on the gritty outskirts of the city. The terminal was intensely crowded, smelling heavily of stale smoke, cheap disinfectant, and desperation. Corey, a man who normally refused to fly anything less than first class, had to swallow his massive pride and beg a sympathetic ticketing agent for a deferred payment ticket. When the agent firmly denied the request, Deon was forced to walk into a shady pawn shop across the street. He desperately tried to leverage his $20,000 gold Rolex watch, shouting at the broker about Swiss craftsmanship. The broker simply laughed in his face, knowing desperate men held absolutely no negotiating power, and handed Deon a mere $300 in crumpled bills. It was barely enough to buy 2 seats on an overnight interstate bus heading back to Georgia. They boarded the massive, dirty vehicle and were forced to sit in the very back row, pressed tightly against the pungent door of the tiny bathroom. Their seatmates were exhausted agricultural laborers and transient drifters who paid absolutely no attention to the 2 ruined men in designer clothing. Every violent jolt of the cheap suspension system rattled their bones as the bus drove endlessly through the dark, miserable night. As the long, agonizing hours ticked by in the dark, noisy cabin of the bus, the profound emptiness of their actual identities began to suffocate them. Since the day they were born, Deon and Corey had constructed their entire self-worth around the massive wealth I provided. They firmly believed that the respect they received in 5-star restaurants, the fearful obedience of their corporate employees, and the adoring attention of their beautiful wives were entirely due to their own inherent greatness. Sitting shoulder to shoulder with men who worked back-breaking manual labor for minimum wage, the truth became violently clear. They possessed absolutely no real survival skills. They did not know how to navigate the actual world without a platinum card acting as their universal key. Take away the private jets, the tailored suits, and the limitless expense accounts, and they were significantly less capable than the tired farm workers sleeping soundly in the seats in front of them. The farm workers actually knew how to survive a hard day and earn an honest wage. My sons only knew how to sign their names on checks they did not earn. They had spent their entire lives mocking the working class, genuinely believing poverty was a moral failing rather than a systemic trap. Now trapped in the suffocating heat of a public bus reeking of their own unwashed sweat, they realized the terrifying truth. Their power, their status, and their supposed superiority were never actually theirs. It all belonged entirely to the aging father they had just tried to discard in the Bahamas like a piece of useless trash. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline when the filthy bus finally hissed to a halt at the downtown terminal. Deon and Corey stumbled out onto the familiar concrete of their home city. They looked like absolute vagrants. They did not stop to rest or find food. They immediately began the long, painful walk toward the towering glass skyscraper that housed the Cole Logistics global headquarters. They desperately clung to the singular hope that their corporate titles still held legal weight, believing they could simply walk into their offices, call their high-priced lawyers, and legally regain control of the empire. They pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors of the main lobby, ignoring the shocked stares of the early morning administrative staff. Deon marched aggressively toward the VIP executive elevators and slapped his secure identification badge against the biometric scanner. The machine let out a sharp, negative buzz. The digital light flashed a solid, glowing red. Corey frantically tried his card. Red again. Access was completely denied. Before they could begin screaming at the lobby security guards, a calm, highly familiar voice echoed across the massive marble room. I was sitting comfortably in a plush leather armchair near the front windows, holding a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. I watched with immense satisfaction as 4 burly security officers carried 3 large cardboard boxes filled with my son's personal office belongings. The guards unceremoniously threw the boxes directly out the front glass doors, spilling expensive desk ornaments, crystal whiskey decanters, and framed Ivy League degrees onto the dirty city sidewalk. The total lockout was complete. Deon stared at the shattered remains of his crystal whiskey decanter, bleeding expensive brown liquid across the dirty concrete sidewalk. The absolute finality of the locked glass doors and the towering skyscraper completely broke whatever fragile remnants of manufactured pride he had left. He slowly turned his head back toward the expansive glass walls of the main lobby, his bloodshot eyes locking directly onto me, sitting calmly inside. The sheer, overwhelming panic vibrating through his unwashed body finally forced him to surrender to gravity. Deon aggressively pushed through the heavy revolving doors and immediately fell hard to his knees on the freezing cold marble floor. He completely ignored the dozens of shocked administrative assistant, security personnel, and junior executives who were freezing in their tracks. They were all watching the disgraced former acting chief executive officer of their company grovel like a desperate beggar off the street. He crawled a few painful inches forward, thick tears streaming down his grimy, sunburnt face, further ruining the collar of his expensive sweat-stained designer shirt. He began sobbing uncontrollably, his voice echoing loudly against the high vaulted ceilings as he desperately tried to rewrite history right in front of my eyes. He screamed out loud that the entire incident at the Nassau port was a horrible, tragic mistake. He pointed a violently trembling accusatory finger back toward the street where his younger brother Corey was still standing completely paralyzed on the sidewalk. Deon wailed at the top of his lungs that Corey and his own wife Megan had secretly orchestrated the entire abandonment behind his back while he was busy in the ship's restroom. I remained perfectly seated in my plush leather armchair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee. The bitter warmth grounded my senses, keeping my facial expression entirely unreadable and completely devoid of any paternal sympathy. I did not order the massive security guards to physically remove him from the premises. Instead, I raised a single commanding hand, signaling the men in dark suits to step back and let the pathetic, humiliating display continue uninterrupted. I wanted every single hardworking employee in that massive lobby to witness exactly what kind of cowardly, spineless man had been trying to steal their livelihoods. Deon took my absolute silence as an open invitation to keep spinning his frantic web of desperate lies. He dragged his knees closer, leaving disgusting dirty smudges across the pristine white marble floor. He cried loudly about how much he truly loved me, claiming he had spent the entire agonizing bus ride from Miami praying to God for my safe return. He lied beautifully, claiming that the moment he realized the massive cruise ship had left the Bahamian dock without me, he had physically fought the ship's captain in a desperate attempt to turn the vessel around. According to his frantic manufactured narrative, he was the absolute victim of a ruthless, calculated conspiracy designed solely by his gold-digging wife and his deeply jealous younger brother. He pounded his dirty fist violently against his chest, loudly invoking the sacred bond of family blood. He begged me to remember that he was my firstborn son, the true and rightful heir to the Cole Logistics legacy. He actually swore on his late mother's grave that he would file for divorce from Megan immediately and permanently cut all ties with Corey if I just let him back into the executive elevator and reinstated his corporate bank accounts. The sheer, terrifying volume of his lies was almost impressive in its absolute lack of shame or morality. He was eagerly throwing everyone he supposedly loved directly under the proverbial bus just to save his own luxurious lifestyle. The employees surrounding the lobby stood in stunned, absolute silence. Couriers dropped their delivery packages. Receptionists completely ignored their ringing telephones. They were watching a grown man, a man who had terrorized them with arrogant demands just 1 week prior, completely disintegrate into a whimpering, pathetic child. Deon reached out his dirty fingers, desperately trying to grasp the immaculate crease of my tailored trousers. I calmly pulled my leg back, refusing to let his physical filth touch me. I let him talk. I let him completely exhaust his lungs and empty his tear ducts. I let him build a massive, elaborate tower of falsehoods right there in the middle of my corporate headquarters. Every single word he spoke was another heavy nail driven straight into his own coffin. As I sat there listening to his spectacular performance, my mind drifted back to all the terrible times I had foolishly sat in similar rooms listening to these exact same apologies. I clearly remembered when Deon was 19 years old and got caught stealing final exam answers at his incredibly expensive private university. He had cried exactly like this, falling to his knees and blaming his innocent roommates for slipping the stolen cheat sheet into his textbook to frame him. I had quietly paid a massive, undisclosed financial donation to the university library fund to keep my son from being publicly expelled and ruining his future. I remembered when he was 30 years old and recklessly crashed a brand new company vehicle into a local storefront while driving under the influence of expensive, illegal narcotics. He had fallen to his knees in my private office that night, crying hysterically and blaming the supposedly terrible steering mechanism of the sports car and the immense, crushing pressure of his new corporate title. I had paid the furious store owner triple the actual repair costs in cash and bribed a high-priced defense attorney to make the criminal charges magically disappear from the public record. Every single time he failed, every single time he hurt an innocent person or broke the law, he used these exact same tears. And every single time I had reached into my deep pockets and bought him a perfectly clean slate. I truly thought I was protecting my own flesh and blood. I thought I was giving him a safe environment to finally mature into a responsible man. But looking down at him now, I realized the horrifying, undeniable truth. My endless financial leniency did not save my son. It created a highly functioning monster. By constantly shielding him from the burning fire of his own consequences, I had effectively taught him that he was completely fireproof. I had proven to him that morality was just a price tag that his father could always afford to pay. Deon finally ran out of breath. He rested his sweaty forehead directly against the cold marble floor, gasping heavily for air, waiting silently for me to offer my usual unconditional forgiveness. He was eagerly waiting for the familiar golden parachute I had always provided to catch his fall. I slowly placed my porcelain coffee cup onto the glass table next to my chair. I reached into my tailored suit jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the glowing screen 3 times, navigating swiftly to the highly secure digital vault where I kept my most valuable corporate assets. Earlier that morning, I had instructed my loyal IT department to seamlessly pair my personal device directly with the building's massive public address system. The exact same high-definition speakers that normally played soft, calming instrumental music throughout the towering lobby were now completely under my direct control. I did not say a single word to my violently weeping son. I simply pressed the play button. A sharp, loud burst of static crackled through the ceiling speakers, instantly grabbing the terrified attention of every single person in the massive room. Then a voice echoed throughout the space with crystal-clear, undeniable precision. It was Deon's own voice, captured perfectly by the hidden security cameras I had legally purchased from the cruise line management team just hours after my rescue. The audio boomed down from the ceiling like the voice of a furious god. "I hope the old man rots in the Bahamas. Hand me another glass of that $5,000 champagne." The recorded sound of Corey laughing maliciously and heavy crystal glasses clinking together followed the cruel, unforgiving declaration. The entire corporate lobby fell completely dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the hard marble floor. Deon froze completely solid. His desperate, manufactured fake tears instantly dried up on his cheeks. He slowly lifted his head from the floor, his face completely devoid of all color, finally realizing his own arrogant voice had just broadcast his absolute guilt to the entire world. The echoing sound of Deon's own recorded voice wishing for my death hung in the stagnant air of the corporate lobby. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. The dozens of employees staring at him no longer held any pity in their eyes. They looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. Deon stayed frozen on the cold marble floor for a long moment, the devastating reality of his public exposure finally sinking into his brain. He realized that his pathetic display of fake tears had failed entirely. I was not going to forgive him, and his grand illusion of being the victim was completely shattered. When begging failed, his deeply ingrained arrogance violently resurfaced as a desperate defense mechanism. He slowly pushed himself up from the dirty floor, wiping his sweaty face with the back of his stained sleeve. His pale complexion flushed with a sudden defensive rage. Corey, who had finally pushed his way through the revolving glass doors after hesitating on the sidewalk, stood frozen next to his brother, taking in the hostile environment. Cornered and utterly humiliated, Deon decided to play his final desperate card. He puffed out his chest, trying to project a false sense of authority despite smelling like a public bus terminal. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that none of this mattered. He shouted at the top of his lungs that he and Corey still legally owned 30% of the combined shares of Cole Logistics. He aggressively declared that they did not need my permission to be rich. They were going to immediately cash out their massive equity, take their hundreds of millions of dollars, and build a rival logistics empire that would absolutely crush my legacy into the dirt. Deon turned away from me with a theatrical scoff, desperate to prove to the surrounding crowd that he still possessed ultimate power. He angrily snapped his fingers at a terrified junior financial analyst standing nearby, aggressively demanding to borrow the young man's mobile phone. The junior employee was too frightened to refuse and quickly handed over his device. Deon snatched it from his hands and aggressively pounded a familiar number into the keypad. He was calling his elite, high-priced Wall Street wealth manager. To ensure everyone in the lobby witnessed his triumphant financial exit, Deon tapped the speakerphone button and held the device up high. He wanted the entire company to hear him liquidate his shares and walk out of the building as a billionaire. Corey stepped closer to his brother, nodding along with a forced, arrogant smirk, desperately clinging to this final lifeline. The phone rang 3 times before a frantic, stressed voice answered on the other end. Deon did not even offer a greeting. He immediately launched into a pompous, aggressive tirade. He loudly identified himself and ordered the broker to immediately initiate a full and total liquidation of both his and Corey's corporate portfolios. He demanded that the shares be sold at the current premium market valuation and instructed the broker to wire the massive sum of cash directly into a new secure private account by the end of the business hour. Deon proudly bragged into the phone that he was completely divesting from my toxic leadership and taking his immense talents elsewhere. He stood there with his chin held high, waiting for the broker to grovel, congratulate him on his bold move, and confirm the massive multi-million-dollar trade. He was absolutely certain this was his ultimate winning move. Deon and Corey fundamentally misunderstood how actual wealth functioned. They believed that holding a piece of paper that said they owned shares made them invincible. But they had never actually sold any of their stock to fund their incredibly lavish lifestyles, because selling shares meant paying massive capital gains taxes and slowly losing their voting power in the boardroom. Instead, they had eagerly utilized a highly risky financial loophole favored by the ultra-wealthy. They had marched into the offices of a major private investment bank and pledged their entire unvested invested corporate stock portfolios as collateral for massive untaxed cash loans. That was exactly how they afforded the multi-million-dollar mansions, the fleets of imported European sports cars, and the endless luxury vacations. They lived like absolute kings, entirely on borrowed money, using my company as their personal casino chips. It was a strategy that worked perfectly fine as long as the underlying stock value remained incredibly high and perfectly stable. But it was a fragile house of cards built over a financial fault line. They had assumed Cole Logistics would simply grow forever on the back of my hard work. They never bothered to read the complex fine print of their massive portfolio loans. They did not understand that if the value of their collateral ever dropped below a certain threshold, the bank possessed the legal right to instantly demand full repayment of the borrowed cash. I knew this. I had known exactly how heavily leveraged they were for years. I knew that their entire luxurious existence was floating on a massive bubble of high-interest debt, and I had specifically designed my public broadcast from Wall Street to be the sharp needle that popped it. The elite Wall Street broker did not respond to Deon's arrogant demands with the expected subservient obedience. Instead, the man on the speakerphone let out a sharp, panicked breath. He interrupted Deon's pompous rant with a voice completely devoid of respect. The broker shouted through the speaker that Deon was completely out of his mind. He bluntly informed my son that he could not liquidate a single share of the portfolio for a profit. The global television broadcast I had made from New York earlier that morning, loudly declaring massive internal fraud and freezing the entire company pending a federal investigation, had completely tanked the internal valuation of Cole Logistics. Institutional investors had panicked, and the private market value of the stock had plummeted by over 80% in a matter of hours. The shares Deon was proudly trying to sell were currently considered entirely worthless toxic assets. Deon's arrogant smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer uncomprehending horror. But the broker was not finished delivering the fatal blow. He explained that because the collateral value had violently collapsed, the investment bank's automated risk management software had been triggered. The bank was officially issuing an immediate margin call. This meant they were not going to receive a single penny of cash from selling their shares. Instead, the exact opposite was happening. The bank was actively demanding that Deon and Corey repay the massive cash loans they had taken out against the now worthless stock. The broker's voice echoed with terrifying clarity through the silent lobby. He explicitly stated that Deon and Corey personally owed the central bank exactly $12 million in pure liquid cash to cover the margin deficit. And because of the extreme volatility of the situation, the bank required the massive payment by 5 o'clock this afternoon. If the funds were not wired by the deadline, the bank would initiate federal financial prosecution, freeze every single asset tied to their names, and seize everything they had ever owned. Deon dropped the borrowed cell phone. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, disconnecting the call and leaving my sons drowning in a suffocating silence of total financial ruin. The sharp crack of the borrowed mobile phone hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, signaling the absolute death of their brotherhood. Corey stood frozen, his eyes wide and vacant, as the broker's terrifying words repeated on a loop in his mind. $12 million in liquid cash. That was the ransom demanded by the bank to cover their massive margin deficit, and they possessed absolutely nothing to pay it. For his entire adult life, Corey had proudly played the role of the careless, wealthy younger brother. He had blindly signed every single financial document Deon ever placed in front of him, trusting his older brother's arrogant assurances that their wealth was infinite and perfectly secure. Corey never bothered to read the complex loan agreements or question the massive collateral they were leveraging. He just wanted the exotic cars, the wild parties, and the VIP treatment. Now standing in the suffocating silence of the corporate lobby, the horrifying reality washed over him. Because he had foolishly allowed Deon to orchestrate their financial lives, Corey was personally on the hook for a massive $6 million federal debt. He looked at Deon, who was staring blankly at the shattered phone on the floor, completely paralyzed by his own monumental failure. The blind loyalty Corey had always maintained instantly evaporated, replaced by a pure blinding rage. Corey did not yell. The anger bubbling inside his chest was far too dark and dense for words. He lunged forward, grabbing Deon violently by the collar of his ruined designer shirt. The sudden aggressive movement shocked the surrounding employees, causing several administrative assistants to scream and step back. Corey dragged his older brother backward, his heavy leather shoes slipping wildly against the polished marble floor. He practically threw Deon through the heavy revolving glass doors, desperate to get him out of the lobby before the massive building security guards could intervene. They stumbled out onto the blazing hot concrete sidewalk, crashing directly into the cardboard boxes of their discarded office belongings. Deon lost his balance and fell hard onto his back, crushing a framed Ivy League diploma under his weight. Before Deon could even raise his hands to defend himself, Corey threw himself on top of his brother and unleashed a vicious, uncoordinated punch. The heavy blow landed squarely on Deon's jaw, producing a sickening crunch that echoed over the loud traffic of the busy Atlanta street. Deon cried out in shock and intense pain, tasting warm blood filling his mouth. Survival instinct finally kicked in, and the older brother fought back with equal ferocity. He drove his knee hard into Corey's ribs, pushing him off and scrambling to his feet. They circled each other on the dirty pavement, panting heavily, looking exactly like two desperate alley cats fighting over a scrap of garbage. Corey charged again, swinging wildly and connecting with Deon's nose. Bright red blood instantly poured down Deon's chin, staining his pristine white collar. They grappled, tearing at each other's expensive clothing, completely oblivious to the massive crowd gathering around them. This was no longer a disagreement over corporate strategy. It was a raw, brutal fight for survival between two men who had just lost absolutely everything. The violent spectacle did not go unnoticed by the outside world. Ever since my live global broadcast from Wall Street earlier that morning, Local news vans and freelance paparazzi had been aggressively circling the Cole Logistics headquarters, desperate for a statement. The moment the fistfight spilled out onto the sidewalk, the media descended like a flock of starving vultures. Dozens of camera lenses pushed through the crowd, capturing every single bloody detail in high definition. The bright, relentless flashing of camera strobes illuminated the humiliating scene. Corey pinned Deon against a concrete planter, landing another heavy blow to his brother's ribs while screaming obscenities about the stolen money and the ruined luxury cars. Deon desperately clawed at Corey's face, leaving deep, bloody scratches across his cheek. They were publicly destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left, providing the global news networks with the perfect, sensational visual representation of the corrupt Cole empire collapsing in real time. The explosive violence erupting on the sidewalk was the devastating culmination of a lifelong toxic resentment that Corey had carefully buried deep beneath a fragile surface of brotherly solidarity. Growing up in the massive shadow of the Cole legacy, Corey was always treated as the secondary afterthought. Deon was the golden child, the supposed heir apparent, who was explicitly groomed to take over the logistics empire. I had foolishly praised Deon for his academic achievements and his aggressive ambition, completely ignoring how deeply that blatant favoritism wounded my younger son. Corey had internalized that rejection, deciding early on that if he could not earn my respect, he would simply drain my bank accounts. He masked his deep insecurity with relentless partying and reckless spending. However, the absolute worst part of his existence was being forced to submit to Deon's suffocating arrogance. Deon treated Corey like a dim-witted sidekick, constantly belittling his intelligence and mocking his lifestyle choices. Deon always demanded total obedience, promising Corey that as long as he followed orders, the money would never stop flowing. Corey hated the condescension. He hated the way Deon spoke down to him at the dinner table and dismissed his opinions in the boardroom. He swallowed his pride and tolerated the endless disrespect for decades, simply because Deon held the keys to the financial kingdom. The massive portfolio loans, the offshore shell accounts, the terrible plot to abandon me in the Bahamas, all of it was Deon's grand design. Corey had gone along with the malicious schemes because he was too lazy and too cowardly to forge his own path. But now the promised kingdom was completely in ashes. The limitless money that had acted as the only glue holding their fragile relationship together was entirely gone. Stripped of the wealth, Corey saw Deon for exactly what he was. He was not a brilliant financial mastermind. He was just a terrified, incompetent fraud who had driven them both directly off a massive cliff. The decades of suppressed jealousy, the endless humiliation, and the sheer terror of facing a massive federal debt finally shattered Corey's restraint, transforming his lifelong resentment into pure, unadulterated physical violence. The chaotic, bloody brawl was finally brought to a violent end by the deafening wail of approaching police sirens. 2 Atlanta Police Department cruisers aggressively jumped the curb, screeching to a halt right on the crowded sidewalk. 4 heavily armed officers leaped from their vehicles, shouting authoritative commands to disperse the crowd of greedy paparazzi. The officers did not recognize the bleeding men as wealthy corporate executives. They saw 2 violent criminals causing a severe public disturbance. They tackled Deon and Corey directly onto the hard concrete, forcefully pressing their bleeding faces against the dirty pavement. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around their wrists, biting painfully into their skin. The cameras continued to flash wildly as the 2 brothers were roughly hauled to their feet and shoved into the cramped plastic back seats of the waiting police cruisers. Several miles away on the gritty outskirts of the city, Megan and Abigail sat in absolute silence on the edge of a stained mattress inside a cheap roadside motel. Having been swiftly evicted from the massive estate and finding all their credit cards completely frozen by the federal investigation, this dingy room was the only shelter they could afford with the cash in their designer purses. The small, fuzzy television mounted in the corner of the room was tuned to a local news station. They watched in absolute horror as the breaking news alert flashed across the screen, broadcasting the live high-definition footage of their husbands engaged in a bloody, humiliating street brawl. They watched the police aggressively shove Deon and Corey into the back of the squad cars. The reality of their terrifying new existence crashed down upon them. Their husbands were not just broke. They were publicly disgraced, millions of dollars in debt to a ruthless central bank, and currently sitting in police custody, facing severe criminal charges. The luxurious, untouchable lives they had married into were completely dead. Megan slowly turned her head and locked eyes with Abigail. They did not shed a single tear for the men they supposedly loved. The pure cold instinct of self-preservation instantly overtook them. Without speaking a single word to each other, both women stood up, stepped outside into the humid motel parking lot, and pulled out their mobile phones. They dialed the private numbers of the most ruthless criminal defense attorneys they knew, prepared to offer the federal prosecutors absolutely anything they wanted in exchange for full immunity. They were ready to turn state's evidence and bury my sons forever. Megan and Abigail did not waste a single second mourning the sudden violent collapse of their marriages. They quickly changed out of their wrinkled patio party clothes and put on the most conservative, expensive designer dresses they had managed to shove into their bags before the eviction. They hailed a cheap rideshare vehicle and rode in absolute calculated silence to the towering federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. They marched through the heavy glass doors of the district attorney's office with the arrogant, unwavering confidence of women who genuinely believed they were always the smartest people in any given room. They bypassed the stunned receptionist entirely and pushed their way directly into the outer office of the lead federal prosecutor assigned to the Cole logistics fraud investigation. They did not politely ask for a meeting. They aggressively demanded one. Megan slammed her expensive leather purse onto the secretary's desk and loudly announced that she and her sister-in-law held the absolute keys to locking Deon and Corey Cole inside a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. But they made their absolute condition perfectly clear before they even sat down in a chair. They demanded full unconditional legal immunity from all prosecution, and they wanted the deal signed in black ink immediately. The lead prosecutor, a hardened veteran of corporate fraud cases who despised white-collar criminals, was more than happy to oblige their ruthless betrayal. He ushered them into a stark, windowless conference room, hit the record button on a digital audio device, and told them to start talking. Megan and Abigail sat side by side, perfectly synchronized in their treacherous performance. They immediately began throwing their husbands directly under the heavy tires of the federal justice system, without a single flinch of hesitation or remorse. Megan reached into her designer purse and pulled out 3 encrypted digital flash drives. She proudly placed them on the cold metal table, explaining with a wicked smile that she had spent the last 2 years secretly backing up Deon's private home computer network. The drives contained thousands of unsanitized internal emails, hidden offshore bank routing numbers, and explicit digital conversations, where Deon detailed exactly how to artificially inflate global shipping manifests to steal massive amounts of capital from corporate shareholders. Abigail quickly followed suit, reaching into her own bag to produce a thick leather-bound physical ledger she had stolen from Corey's private wall safe. The heavy ledger meticulously documented every single illegal sports bet, every massive underground gambling debt paid with company funds, and a long damning list of cash bribes paid to local port inspectors to look the other way when Cole logistics trucks arrived dangerously overweight. They detailed the complex crimes with chilling surgical precision. They painted themselves as terrified captive wives who were forced to witness these horrific financial atrocities under the constant threat of emotional and financial abuse. They claimed they had been secretly gathering this massive mountain of evidence for years, just waiting for the perfect, safe moment to bring it to the proper authorities. They sang like absolute canaries, actively competing with one another to see who could provide the prosecutor with the most devastating piece of evidence. Megan threw Deon's entire executive leadership team to the wolves, naming every junior vice president who had ever signed a fraudulent expense report to cover up the missing money. Abigail eagerly provided the exact dates, times, and locations where Corey had met with dangerous illegal loan sharks to borrow against his unvested company stock. They were a highly efficient 2-woman demolition crew, actively destroying the men they had sworn to love through sickness and health. The prosecutor simply sat back in his chair and watched the slaughter, completely amazed by the sheer volume of high-quality evidence being handed to him on a silver platter. Deon and Corey thought they were the undisputed masterminds of their relationships, completely unaware that their wives had been quietly building the perfect, undeniable criminal case against them from the safety of their own luxury bedrooms. The women ensured that every single loophole was closed. They provided passwords to the encrypted files and offered to testify in open court in front of a jury. They wanted absolutely no chance of Deon and Corey ever walking free again. This spectacular, cold-blooded betrayal was the inevitable conclusion of marriages built entirely on a foundation of shallow transactions. Megan and Abigail never actually loved my sons. They only ever loved the limitless, unquestioned access to the massive Cole fortune. When Megan first met Deon at a high-profile charity gala 10 years ago, she specifically targeted him because she knew he was the arrogant weak link to my massive logistics empire. She endured his obnoxious behavior, his terrible temper tantrums, and his constant infidelity simply because his Black American Express card perfectly funded her luxurious reality. Abigail was exactly the same breed of parasite. She married Corey fully knowing he was a reckless degenerate with severe impulse control issues, but she considered his gambling addiction a perfectly acceptable tax to pay, in exchange for a sprawling estate, personal chefs, and a fleet of imported luxury vehicles. They viewed their husbands not as equal life partners, but as incredibly lucrative employers who could easily be managed. Their sacred wedding vows were nothing more than ironclad employment contracts, and now that the company had violently gone bankrupt, they were simply terminating the agreement. They felt absolutely no guilt regarding their actions today. In their twisted, highly self-centered minds, Deon and Corey had fundamentally breached the marriage contract by losing the money, exposing their crimes, and getting arrested on national television. The men had utterly failed to provide the required standard of luxury, so they deserved to be discarded to the federal prison system like broken, useless tools. Genuine loyalty was an entirely foreign concept to women who measured human worth strictly by bank account balances and social status. They were perfectly happy to step over the rotting corpses of their marriages if it meant they avoided wearing orange jumpsuits. While they were busy selling their husbands out to the federal government in a windowless room, I was actively monitoring their every single move from my office. My corporate security team had easily tracked their rideshare directly to the courthouse steps. I knew exactly what they were doing, and I refused to let them walk away from this disaster cleanly. As the lead prosecutor briefly stepped out of the room to consult with his superiors regarding the final immunity agreements, Megan and Abigail sat alone in the quiet waiting area. They smiled warmly at each other, quietly congratulating themselves on securing their absolute freedom and outsmarting the justice system. At that exact moment, a sharp-dressed legal courier walked into the waiting room. He asked for Abigail by her full legal name and handed her a thick, unmarked manila envelope before turning and walking away without saying a single word. Abigail frowned slightly, tearing open the heavy paper seal as Megan looked on with mild curiosity. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of 8 by 10 glossy photographs. Abigail pulled them out and her breath caught violently in her throat. The high-definition images showed Megan in highly compromising, intimately explicit positions inside a luxury downtown hotel room. But the man in the photographs with Megan was not Deon. It was Corey's lead private defense attorney. The very same high-priced lawyer Corey was currently depending on to keep him out of federal prison. I had hired elite private investigators to follow Megan months ago, knowing a woman with absolutely no morals would eventually make a fatal mistake. Abigail stared at the photographs, the brutal realization hitting her like a freight train. Megan had been sleeping with Corey's lawyer, ensuring she had total inside knowledge and legal leverage over both brothers to save only herself. Abigail slowly turned her head, her eyes burning with pure, murderous hatred as she looked directly at her sister-in-law. The fragile alliance of the two betrayers instantly snapped in half. The brutal reality of the criminal justice system does not care about tailored suits or Ivy League degrees. Deep inside the federal detention center in downtown Atlanta, Deon and Corey sat in completely separate windowless interrogation rooms. The heavy steel doors were locked tight from the outside. They had been stripped of their ruined designer clothing and forced into highly abrasive neon orange canvas jumpsuits. The bright fluorescent lights hummed loudly overhead, casting harsh shadows against the cinder-block walls. Deon sat rigidly in his hard metal chair, staring at the heavy steel handcuffs firmly securing his wrists to the bolted table. He was shivering, completely unable to process the sheer speed of his total downfall. Just a few days ago, he was drinking $5,000 champagne on a luxury cruise ship in the Caribbean, firmly believing he was the undisputed king of a billion-dollar empire. Now, he was just another federal inmate waiting to be processed for massive corporate fraud. In the room right next door, Corey was hunched over the table, his face buried in his hands, quietly weeping. The profound silence of the holding facility was suddenly broken by the heavy clanking of keys. The heavy steel door to Corey's room swung open. Two hardened federal investigators walked into Corey's interrogation room. They did not offer him a glass of water or pretend to be his friend. The lead detective dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the metal table and pulled out a small digital audio recorder. He looked directly at Corey and bluntly stated that his entire defense strategy was already completely dead. Before Corey could even attempt to lie or demand his high-priced lawyer, the detective pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio of Abigail's voice echoed off the cinder-block walls. She was calmly, methodically detailing exactly how Corey had systematically drained corporate accounts to pay off violent underground loan sharks. Corey lifted his head, his eyes widening in absolute horror, as he listened to the woman he loved casually hand the federal government the exact dates and times of his most secret, devastating crimes. He physically recoiled as if he had been struck. But the detective was not finished destroying him. He pressed a button to skip to the next audio file. This time it was Megan's voice. She was gleefully throwing Corey under the bus, explicitly detailing his illegal gambling habits to secure her own immunity. The detective paused the recording and leaned across the metal table. He informed Corey that the two women had just signed full immunity deals and were actively competing to see who could lock the brothers away the longest. Corey shook his head violently, his chains rattling loudly against the metal table. He frantically stammered that his private defense attorney would completely tear their testimonies apart in court. The second detective let out a cold, humorless laugh. He reached into the thick manila folder and pulled out a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs. He slid them slowly across the table until they rested directly under Corey's trembling nose. The images were incredibly explicit, showing Megan intimately entwined with a man in a luxury hotel suite. Corey stared at the photos, his brain struggling to comprehend the massive betrayal. He recognized the man immediately. It was his own lead private defense attorney. The very same man Corey was currently relying on to save his life had been actively sleeping with his sister-in-law and helping her orchestrate this massive legal ambush. The realization hit Corey with the force of a physical explosion. He let out a loud, agonizing scream that echoed down the entire concrete hallway. He violently swept his chained hands across the table, knocking the photographs onto the floor. His brother had ruined him financially. His wife had sold him to the federal government. His sister-in-law had slept with his only legal lifeline. Corey collapsed forward, resting his forehead against the cold metal, sobbing with a level of pure, unadulterated despair that completely shattered his mind. He was entirely alone, surrounded by wolves he had foolishly invited into his own house. The psychological toll of moving from an elite luxury penthouse to a freezing concrete cell in less than a week is incredibly brutal. For their entire lives, Deon and Corey had existed inside a perfectly insulated bubble of extreme wealth. If the temperature in their mansions was a single degree too hot, they would scream at their staff to fix it immediately. If a private chef slightly overcooked a premium steak, the plate was violently thrown into the trash. They had never known physical discomfort, hunger, or genuine fear. Their money had acted as a magical buffer against the harsh realities of the actual world. But inside the federal detention center, that buffer was completely eradicated. The neon orange jumpsuits were incredibly stiff and scratched their soft, heavily moisturized skin. The thin mattress in the holding cell offered absolutely no support, leaving their bodies aching from the cold steel bunk. The food slid through a small slot in the door, was tasteless, processed, and completely terrifying to men used to imported caviar. This sudden, violent transition completely broke their spirits. They were stripped of their names and reduced to mere federal identification numbers. The crushing realization that their father's money was no longer there to bail them out forced them to finally look at their own pathetic reflections. They were incredibly weak men. Without their tailored suits and platinum credit cards, they possessed absolutely zero internal strength to survive the brutal environment they now found themselves trapped inside. Down the hall in the other interrogation room, Deon was faring no better. He was frantically pacing the small length of his chain, sweating profusely, wondering why nobody had answered his phone calls. The heavy door finally swung open, but it was not the federal investigators. It was a man wearing a remarkably sharp three-piece charcoal suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. This was his lead counsel, the most ruthless, expensive criminal defense attorney in Atlanta, hired through an emergency retainer Deon had established months ago for a completely different corporate issue. The lawyer did not look sympathetic. He sat down at the table, completely ignoring Deon's panicked questions about bail money. He bluntly stated that the federal case against Deon was an absolute nightmare, perfectly wrapped up with a neat bow, thanks to the devastating immunity deals his wife and sister-in-law had just signed. However, the lawyer smiled a sharp, predatory smile. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal filings. He told Deon they were not going to try and fight the massive financial evidence. Instead, they were going to execute a highly malicious, desperate offensive strike. He explained his terrifying plan. They were going to officially plead not guilty by completely destroying my character. They would file a massive federal countersuit claiming that I, Leland Cole, had been suffering from severe undocumented dementia for years. They would falsely claim that my recent actions were the dangerous paranoid delusions of a legally insane old man and charge me with extreme elder abuse and criminal fraud against my own family. They were going to drag my legacy through the mud and try to lock me in a psychiatric ward to legally steal the company back. 6 weeks later, the massive media circus finally descended upon the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta. The highly anticipated criminal trial of Deon and Corey Cole had officially begun. The sprawling courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Journalists from major financial networks, curious corporate spectators, and grim-faced federal agents filled every single wooden bench in the gallery. I sat completely still at the prosecution table next to my attorney, Mr. Rosenberg, wearing a conservative navy blue suit and a perfectly knotted silk tie. Across the center aisle, Deon and Corey sat closely with their massive, incredibly expensive legal team. My sons were completely stripped of their usual confident arrogance, looking exhausted and visibly terrified of the federal judge presiding over their fate. Their newly hired lead defense attorney, the ruthless man in the sharp charcoal suit, stood up confidently to deliver his opening statement. He did not attempt to deny the massive $50 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. He did not even try to deny the existence of the secret offshore accounts or the illegal gambling debts. Instead, he executed his highly malicious, incredibly desperate strategy. He turned his body directly toward the jury box and painted a horrifying, entirely fabricated picture of me. He described Leland Cole not as a self-made corporate titan who built an empire from a single truck, but as a tyrannical, deeply abusive patriarch who was currently suffering from severe, undiagnosed dementia. He claimed with a straight, convincing face that my sons were not greedy white-collar criminals. He portrayed them as desperate, terrified children, trying to quietly protect a billion-dollar logistics empire from a legally insane old man who was violently destroying his own legacy from the inside out. To support this grotesque, highly calculated narrative, the defense team orchestrated a magnificent parade of absolute perjury. Over the next 3 grueling days, they called a series of fake, heavily compensated witnesses to the stand to testify about my allegedly erratic behavior. First came a former estate groundskeeper whom I had fired 2 years ago for stealing expensive landscaping equipment. He sat under oath, looked directly at the jury, and swore that he had repeatedly seen me wandering the massive gardens of my home in the middle of the freezing night. He claimed I was shouting aggressively at the trees, wearing nothing but a bathrobe, and completely unable to remember my own name or where I lived. Next came a junior logistics manager, a highly ambitious man Deon had specifically promoted just weeks before the fateful cruise. The young executive claimed I had violently stormed into a confidential board meeting, thrown a cup of hot coffee against the projection screen, and ordered the immediate termination of employees who did not even exist within the company directory. The lies were incredibly detailed, designed by the defense attorney to perfectly corroborate the narrative of a man rapidly losing his grip on reality. But the absolute peak of this disgusting theatrical performance came when Deon himself was finally called to the witness stand. Deon wore a slightly oversized cheap suit to make himself look thin, fragile, and overwhelmed by the stress of his situation. As soon as he raised his right hand to swear on the Bible, the fake tears immediately began to flow. He sobbed directly into the microphone, his voice cracking with manufactured grief as he told the jury how much it broke his heart to watch his childhood hero fade into madness. He spun a miraculous, completely fabricated tale about the incident at the Nassau port. He claimed I had suffered a massive, terrifying psychotic break on the upper deck of the luxury cruise ship. According to Deon, I had become incredibly violent, striking a hospitality crew member in the face and running away from my family at the dock. He swore under penalty of perjury that he and Corey had desperately searched the Bahamian island for hours, crying and begging the local police for help, only to be forced back onto the ship by strict maritime authorities when the vessel was cleared for departure. He looked directly at the sympathetic faces in the jury box and stated that freezing the corporate accounts and moving the money offshore was the absolute only way to save the thousands of innocent employees from my erratic, highly destructive commands. He was playing the ultimate victim, a loving son martyred by a cruel, failing father. The jury leaned forward, visibly moved by his incredible tear-soaked performance. Throughout this entire grueling circus, I remained absolutely motionless at my table. I did not shake my head in disgust when the witnesses lied. I did not whisper angry rebuttals into Mr. Rosenberg's ear. I maintained an absolute cold, impenetrable silence. Watching my own flesh and blood drag my hard-earned legacy through the mud was a profound, agonizing experience. I had spent 50 grueling years building a pristine reputation in the city of Atlanta. I was known globally as a man of absolute integrity, a man whose simple handshake was equivalent to a legally binding contract. Now my own children were attempting to legally declare me a raving lunatic, just to escape their inevitable federal prison sentences. As Deon cried loudly on the stand, my mind flashed back to the very day he was born. I remembered holding his tiny, fragile body in the hospital room, quietly promising his exhausted mother that I would give him the entire world. I had worked myself to the bone to ensure he never knew the crushing weight of poverty that I had endured as a young man. I gave him elite education's luxury vehicles and a guaranteed executive position at my right hand. In return for a lifetime of unconditional provision, he was publicly assassinating my character. They were not just trying to take my money anymore. They were trying to completely erase my dignity and lock me away in a sterile psychiatric ward until my heart stopped beating. My silence in that courtroom was not a sign of submission or defeat. It was the terrifying calm of an apex predator patiently watching its prey walk directly into a fatal trap. The defense attorney finally concluded his highly dramatic questioning. He thanked Deon for his bravery, shot a smug, victorious look directly in my direction, and proudly announced to the judge that the defense rested its case. A heavy murmur rippled through the packed courtroom. The journalists in the gallery began scribbling furiously on their notepads, completely convinced that my sons had successfully manufactured reasonable doubt. The judge banged his wooden gavel loudly to restore order and looked down at my table over his reading glasses. He asked Mr. Rosenberg if we were ready to present our rebuttal evidence and call our defense witnesses. The entire room expected me to take the stand to desperately defend my own sanity. Mr. Rosenberg stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a completely unbothered, predatory smirk resting on his face. He announced in a booming, highly confident voice that we would not be calling a long list of character witnesses to refute the defense. He stated that we only needed a single person to completely dismantle the absurd fairy tale the jury had just heard. Mr. Rosenberg turned toward the heavy wooden doors at the very back of the courtroom and called Dr. Gregory Hayes to the stand. Deon, who was just stepping down from the witness box, completely froze in his tracks. All the remaining color violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Dr. Hayes was the elite, highly exclusive private concierge doctor Deon had secretly hired and heavily bribed months ago to officially falsify my medical records. Deon watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the doctor confidently pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked straight down the center aisle. The man Deon had paid to destroy me was now my ultimate weapon. Dr. Gregory Hayes walked past the heavy wooden swinging gates with the stiff, formal posture of a man carrying a loaded weapon. He was a highly respected, impeccably dressed concierge physician known for treating the absolute wealthiest families in the exclusive neighborhoods of Atlanta. As the armed bailiff swore him in, asking him to state his full name for the official court record, Deon leaned forward eagerly at the defense table. A brief flash of profound confusion crossed my oldest son's face, quickly replaced by a sickening, misguided smirk of absolute triumph. Deon genuinely believed Mr. Rosenberg had just made a fatal amateur mistake by calling this specific witness to the stand. Deon had personally visited Dr. Hayes' private clinic, paying the man a massive sum of untraceable cash in an unmarked envelope just 4 months ago to officially diagnose me with rapid-onset dementia. He firmly thought Dr. Hayes was about to sit in that leather chair and legally validate the entire fabricated defense strategy they had spent days building. He thought his expensive bribe had permanently secured him a bulletproof medical alibi. Deon even nudged his high-priced defense attorney, whispering something highly arrogant behind his hand while adjusting his silk tie. He had absolutely no idea that my private security team had discovered his bribery scheme within hours. He did not know that I had matched his cash envelope with a terrifying, ironclad legal threat that completely destroyed the doctor's leverage, forcing the corrupt physician to immediately become a cooperating federal witness to save his own medical license. Mr. Rosenberg approached the witness stand with the slow, deliberate, and highly intimidating stride of a professional executioner. He did not waste the court's time asking Dr. Hayes about his extensive medical background, his Ivy League education, or his prestigious hospital credentials. He immediately cut straight to the absolute bone of the matter. He asked the doctor to explain the exact, uncensored nature of the private, off-the-books consultation Deon Cole had aggressively requested earlier that year. Deon sat back in his chair, crossing his arms and waiting for the purchased lie to save his life. Instead, Dr. Hayes reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a small, heavy encrypted digital hard drive. He held the metallic device high in the air for the judge and the jury to clearly see. The doctor's voice was completely steady, though tinged with deep shame as he testified that he had absolutely not come to confirm my alleged dementia. He stated clearly that he had come to submit physical, irrefutable evidence of a terrifying medical conspiracy. He handed the drive directly to the court clerk, stating for the record that it contained dozens of time-stamped emails, encrypted text messages, and secretly recorded phone calls pulled directly from Deon's private corporate servers. Mr. Rosenberg instructed the court technician to immediately project the contents of the drive onto the massive high-definition screens positioned around the courtroom. The entire room held its collective breath as the stark black and white text of Deon's private emails filled the glowing monitors. Deon was not simply asking for a forged piece of paper containing a misdiagnosis. He was explicitly requesting heavy illegal sedatives and highly restricted military-grade neuroinhibitors. The projected emails detailed a cold, highly calculated request for a specific, deadly chemical cocktail designed to violently and permanently induce the exact physical symptoms of advanced-stage Alzheimer's disease. Deon had aggressively demanded medications that would completely deteriorate my cognitive functions, cause severe, irreversible memory loss, and physically destroy my neural pathways. He had coldly negotiated the exact daily dosage required to make me permanently incapacitated within a matter of weeks, guaranteeing I would never possess the mental clarity to legally contest his hostile corporate takeover. The doctor testified, his voice echoing through the silent room, that Deon had promised to double his annual clinic funding if he agreed to silently administer the toxic drugs through my routine weekly vitamin injections. Panic, pure and unadulterated, violently seized Deon. His arrogant smirk instantly melted into a pathetic mask of sheer suffocating terror. He violently grabbed his lawyer's arm, shaking his head and desperately whispering that the emails were fabricated, but the digital IP signatures on the screen were absolutely undeniable. Even Corey, sitting just a few feet away, stared at his older brother in absolute horror, completely unaware that Deon had planned to chemically lobotomize their father. I sat perfectly still at the prosecution table, staring up at the massive screens displaying the exact chemical formula my own son had intended to secretly pump into my veins. The sheer, terrifying reality of Deon's boundless sociopathic greed was finally laid bare for the entire world to witness. This was no longer a simple, predictable case of white-collar financial fraud. This was not just a greedy heir trying to illegally expedite his inheritance. Nor was it just a pathetic plot to carelessly abandon an old man at a tropical port. Deon was actively and methodically plotting to permanently destroy my brain. He was completely willing to trap me inside my own failing physical body, chemically lobotomizing the very father who had given him absolutely everything just to secure total unchecked control of a logistics company. He wanted to stand by and watch me slowly forget my own name. He wanted to watch me forget the beautiful face of my beloved late wife. He was fully prepared to let me suffer the agonizing, terrifying humiliation of losing my mind, all so he could comfortably buy more imported sports cars and satisfy the endless financial demands of his gold-digging wife. The profound, bottomless darkness required to execute such a horrific plan against your own flesh and blood was completely unfathomable to a rational human being. I had spent my entire adult life building a massive empire to ensure my children would never experience the pain and suffering I had endured, and my oldest son had spent his adult life plotting a highly sophisticated way to torture me into a permanent chemical oblivion. He viewed my mind, the incredibly sharp tool that had built his entire luxurious reality from nothing, as nothing more than a stubborn, inconvenient obstacle that needed to be violently eradicated. A collective, deeply horrified gasp rippled violently through the packed courtroom. Seasoned journalists completely stopped typing on their laptops, their mouths hanging wide open in absolute stunned shock. The jury members looked at Deon with pure visceral disgust, physically leaning their bodies away from his side of the room as if his mere presence was a highly contagious disease. The high-priced, arrogant defense attorney in the charcoal suit stared blankly at the projected emails, his highly trained eyes rapidly scanning the undeniable time-stamped proof of his client's incredibly malicious plot. He realized in a fraction of a second that Deon had completely, utterly lied to him, weaponizing his elite legal expertise to unknowingly defend a violent sociopathic predator. The attorney's face turned bright red with furious professional indignation. He violently slammed his expensive silver fountain pen down onto the heavy wooden defense table. The sharp, aggressive crack echoed loudly through the stunned silence of the massive room. The lawyer abruptly stood up loudly, interrupting Mr. Rosenberg's line of questioning without waiting for permission. He looked directly up at the high wooden bench and formally requested that the federal judge allow him to immediately withdraw as lead defense counsel. He stated loudly, ensuring the official court stenographer recorded every single word, that he had been actively, maliciously deceived by his client. He furiously declared that he absolutely refused to suborn perjury or participate in a defense built entirely on a foundation of attempted murder. Deon reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the lawyer's tailored jacket sleeve, but the attorney ripped his arm away with a look of absolute, unapologetic disgust. The federal judge banged his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly, his face pale with righteous judicial anger. He loudly granted the attorney's immediate withdrawal from the case. Then the judge turned his furious, piercing gaze directly toward the federal prosecutor's table. He commanded the prosecuting attorneys to immediately amend the grand jury indictment right there on the floor. The judge declared in a booming, terrifying voice that based on the explicit, undeniable medical evidence just presented to the court, the charges against Deon Cole were instantly escalating from corporate wire fraud to conspiracy to commit first-degree attempted murder. The deafening silence of the federal courtroom was suddenly shattered by the sharp, authoritative crack of the judge's heavy wooden gavel. The trial had moved with terrifying speed after Dr. Hayes delivered his damning medical testimony. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours, a remarkably short amount of time that signaled absolute, undeniable consensus. Everyone in the packed gallery stood in rigid anticipation as the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box. Deon and Corey stood side by side at the defense table. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken from weeks of sleepless terror inside the detention center. The arrogance that had defined their entire existence was completely eradicated, replaced by the trembling, animalistic fear of trapped prey. The court clerk took the sealed envelope from the jury foreperson, her footsteps echoing loudly across the polished floor. I sat perfectly still at the prosecution table, my hands resting calmly on the wooden surface. I did not look at my sons. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the federal judge as he adjusted his reading glasses and opened the heavy parchment to read the final, inescapable verdict aloud to the world. The word guilty struck the silent room like a physical blow. The judge methodically read through the massive list of federal charges, and the verdict remained devastatingly consistent. Guilty of massive corporate wire fraud. Guilty of international money laundering. Guilty of criminal conspiracy. And finally, the most severe charge of all, guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree attempted murder. Deon's knees instantly gave out. He collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, burying his face in his trembling hands as a wretched, guttural sob ripped from his throat. Corey stared blankly ahead, completely paralyzed, a small puddle of urine slowly forming near his expensive leather shoes as his body completely betrayed him. The judge did not offer a single shred of judicial mercy. He looked down at my 2 sons with a gaze of pure, unfiltered disgust. He explicitly stated that their crimes were driven by a level of sociopathic greed that shocked the conscience of the court. He noted that their extreme wealth and privileged upbringing made their actions even more despicable, as they had acted not out of desperation, but out of sheer gluttonous malice. With another heavy strike of his gavel, the judge delivered the crushing sentence. Deon and Corey Cole were ordered to serve 20 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. Furthermore, the judge signed an immediate federal seizure order. Every single remaining asset tied to their names, the sprawling luxury mansions, the fleets of imported sports cars, the frozen offshore bank accounts, and all unvested corporate stock was completely confiscated by the United States government to pay for massive financial restitution. They were stripped of their freedom and reduced to absolute zero in the span of 5 minutes. 2 heavily armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing my sons roughly by the shoulders. The harsh, metallic clicking of heavy steel chains echoed through the room as their wrists and ankles were bound together. Deon desperately twisted his head toward my table, screaming my name, begging for a financial bailout that was never going to come. Corey simply wept silently, his spirit entirely broken. As I watched the federal marshals forcefully march my own flesh and blood out the side door of the courtroom, I felt absolutely no sense of victory. There was no triumphant satisfaction, no joyful vindication in seeing my children shackled like violent animals. I only felt a deep, profound emptiness. A father's ultimate biological duty is to protect and nurture his offspring to build a safe foundation so they can thrive long after he is gone. But when the offspring mutate into a deadly virus that actively seeks to destroy the very foundation that sustains them, the role of the father must violently change into the role of a surgeon. I had not sent my sons to prison out of petty revenge. I had performed a necessary agonizing amputation to save the healthy host. Cole Logistics was not just a company. It was the lifeblood of thousands of hardworking, innocent employees who relied on my leadership to feed their own families. If I had allowed Deon and Corey to continue their toxic reign, they would have bankrupted the empire and thrown thousands of good people into poverty. My sons had chosen their own disastrous path the moment they placed a price tag on my sanity and my life. They had forced my hand. I remained seated long after the gallery had emptied, staring at the empty defense table, quietly mourning the beautiful, innocent little boys they used to be, and burying the monstrous men they had chosen to become. I slowly stood up, adjusted the cuffs of my navy suit, and walked out through the heavy mahogany doors of the courthouse. The chaotic media circus waiting on the front steps aggressively flashed their cameras, but my private security team expertly formed a tight perimeter, guiding me safely down the stone steps toward my waiting armored Maybach. The heavy rear door was just swinging open when a frantic, disheveled figure violently shoved her way past a local news reporter and threw herself directly onto the hood of my car. It was Megan. She looked absolutely nothing like the perfectly manicured society wife who had previously sneered at my heritage. Her expensive blonde hair was matted, her cheap clothes were stained, and her eyes were wide with pure, desperate madness. Since the federal government had seized all of Deon's assets, she was completely bankrupt, living out of a cheap suitcase and facing total ruin. My security guards immediately moved to pull her off the vehicle, but she screamed at the top of her lungs, waving a small, crumpled photograph in her hand. It was a picture of my infant grandson. Megan locked her crazed eyes directly onto mine and unleashed her absolute last pathetic weapon. She shrieked that if I did not wire $5 million into an untraceable account by midnight, she would take the boy and disappear forever. She swore I would never see my only grandchild again. Megan pounded her fists violently against the reinforced tinted glass of my armored vehicle, her shrill, desperate voice piercing right through the heavy doors. She was aggressively clutching my infant grandson tightly against her chest, treating the fragile child like a high-value human shield. The poor boy was wailing in sheer terror, his face bright red, completely overwhelmed by the chaotic flashing lights of the surrounding paparazzi and his mother's unhinged, violent screaming. She was literally using her own flesh and blood as a hostage in a disgusting public ransom negotiation. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that $5 million was an incredibly cheap price to pay for the boy's safe return to my life. She demanded I roll down the window and initiate the wire transfer, right this second threatening to flee the country and legally change his name by morning. My private security guards immediately stepped forward, their faces stern, fully prepared to physically pull her away from the vehicle to protect me. I raised a single commanding hand from the back seat, signaling the massive men to stop their advance. I absolutely did not want them to accidentally harm the crying infant trapped in her frantic, unpredictable arms. Megan stared fiercely through the dark glass, her chest heaving, fully expecting me to panic and submit to her demands. She had spent the last 24 hours meticulously planning this final, desperate extortion attempt. She knew exactly how deeply I valued family lineage, and she was absolutely certain I would immediately deploy my massive army of corporate lawyers to fight for full, uncompromising custody of the child. She desperately wanted me to drag her into a highly publicized, incredibly expensive family court battle. In her twisted, highly manipulative mind, a protracted legal war was her absolute best-case scenario. A vicious custody battle meant I would be legally forced to pay her exorbitant attorney fees, provide her with a temporary luxury residence during the proceedings, and eventually offer her a massive multi-million-dollar financial settlement out of court just to make her go away quietly. She was actively trying to weaponize my love for my grandson to secure her own luxurious early retirement. I stared back at her through the thick glass, my facial expression completely devoid of any sympathy, anger, or fear. I pressed the silver button on the door panel, lowering the window just a few inches, so my voice could clearly reach her ears without exposing myself to her physical violence. The humid, suffocating Atlanta air immediately flooded the quiet, air-conditioned cabin of the Maybach, carrying the harsh sound of her frantic breathing and the baby's helpless, exhausted crying. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her I absolutely refused to play her sick extortionist game. I stated in a calm, unwavering voice that I would not spend a single penny filing for custody. I would not hire a single family lawyer, and I would not make any legal attempt to take the boy away from his biological mother. Megan completely stopped screaming. The fierce, aggressive entitlement vanished, and a look of profound, paralyzing confusion washed over her tear-stained face. Her entire extortion strategy relied entirely on my willingness to fight her for the child. By completely surrendering the custody battle before it even began, I instantly neutralized her only remaining leverage. I bluntly informed her that since she wanted to use the child as a bargaining chip, she was now completely and entirely responsible for his survival. She was the sole custodial parent of a demanding infant, and she was completely bankrupt. I reminded her that the federal government had frozen all her joint bank accounts and seized her marital assets to pay for Deon's massive criminal restitution. She had absolutely no income, no wealthy husband to leech off of, and no wealthy father-in-law to quietly pay her massive credit card bills. She was entirely on her own. She would have to figure out how to buy expensive baby formula diapers and warm clothing with the few crumpled dollar bills currently sitting at the bottom of her seized designer purse. The brutal, inescapable reality of severe poverty crashed down upon Megan like a massive physical weight. For her entire adult life, she had viewed motherhood not as a sacred duty, but as the ultimate social status symbol. When my grandson was born, she had instantly hired a dedicated team of 3 elite full-time nannies to handle every single difficult aspect of raising a child. She had never actually changed a dirty diaper, she had never stayed awake through a grueling night of infant teething, and she had never once worried about the incredibly high cost of pediatric health care or early education. She treated the boy like a premium designer accessory, dressing him in incredibly expensive imported outfits for carefully curated social media photographs, before immediately handing him back to the hired help so she could attend lavish afternoon cocktail parties with her wealthy friends. Her absolute worst, most terrifying nightmare was not losing her husband to a federal prison sentence. Her ultimate nightmare was becoming an ordinary, invisible, working-class single mother. She suddenly realized that without my massive financial umbrella shielding her from the real world, she would be forced to permanently abandon her exclusive country club memberships and immediately apply for a minimum wage job just to keep her child from starving. She would have to stand on her feet for 10 exhausting hours a day, serving coffee or folding clothes, only to return to a tiny, dangerous, roach-infested apartment in a bad neighborhood. She would have to rely on unreliable public transportation and navigate the exhausting, deeply underfunded public assistance programs she had spent her entire privileged life actively mocking and voting against. The sheer suffocating terror of performing manual labor and facing permanent financial instability completely paralyzed her mind. Megan clutched the crying baby tighter against her chest, her mouth opening and closing silently as her grand extortion plot completely disintegrated into dust. She desperately tried to formulate another empty threat, stammering weakly that the federal courts would somehow force me to pay exorbitant grandfatherly child support to maintain the boy's standard of living. I let out a sharp, cold laugh that cut right through her pathetic, lingering delusion. I rolled the armored window down the rest of the way and delivered the absolute final blow to her greedy, parasitic existence. I looked her dead in the eye and calmly informed her that I had already visited my elite estate planners earlier that very morning. I had officially established a massive, ironclad $10 million trust fund exclusively in my grandson's name. The money was securely locked in a high-yield, untouchable account to guarantee the boy would have a brilliant, financially secure future without her interference. However, I explicitly engineered the complex legal framework of the trust to ensure she could never exploit a single dime of it. I informed Megan that she was permanently legally barred from accessing the fortune. She could not borrow against it, she could not use it for daily living expenses, and she could not petition any sympathetic judge to release the funds early. The massive inheritance would remain completely frozen and legally untouchable until the boy celebrated his 25th birthday. He would grow up to be an incredibly wealthy young man, but his mother would have to suffer in absolute grinding poverty for the next 2 decades just to survive. Megan let out a terrifying, gut-wrenching wail of pure defeat. Her knees completely gave out beneath her and she collapsed violently onto the hard concrete of the courthouse parking lot, drowning in the absolute despair of her ruined life as my driver slowly pulled the Maybach away. 6 months later, the blistering heat of the Atlanta summer was entirely unforgiving, especially inside the cramped, un-air-conditioned kitchen of a roadside diner on the gritty outskirts of the city. Megan pushed violently through the swinging metal doors, balancing a heavy, greasy plastic tray loaded with plates of cheap meatloaf and lukewarm coffee. Her once flawless, perfectly manicured hands were now severely blistered, the soft skin cracked and deeply stained with harsh industrial dish soap. She wore a hideous, heavily stained polyester brown uniform that clung uncomfortably to her sweating back. It was a brutal, humiliating departure from the custom-tailored silk dresses she used to casually flaunt at exclusive country club galas. Across the sticky, foul-smelling dining room floor, Abigail was aggressively scrubbing a vinyl booth where a child had just spilled a large, sticky strawberry milkshake. Abigail's expensive blonde hair was tied back in a frayed elastic band, her face flushed dark red with extreme physical exhaustion and deeply suppressed rage. For 10 grueling hours a day, 6 days a week, the two women were subjected to the relentless, degrading demands of rude long-haul truckers, impatient tourists, and a tyrannical shift manager who screamed at them for taking unauthorized bathroom breaks. Their massive luxury estates, the private chefs, and the endless champagne-fueled shopping sprees in Paris felt like a feverish hallucination from a completely different lifetime. They had absolutely no financial safety net left. The massive $10 million trust fund I established for Megan's child was securely locked away, completely impenetrable by any desperate cheap lawyer she tried to hire. Every single dollar they earned at the diner now went directly toward paying incredibly high rent for a tiny roach-infested apartment and buying basic groceries. The absolute crushing weight of the grueling working-class reality they had spent their entire privileged lives mocking was finally breaking them down day by agonizing day. While Megan and Abigail were desperately scraping loose pennies together from sticky diner tables, I was sitting comfortably at the head of the massive, polished mahogany boardroom table inside the Cole Logistics Global Headquarters. The atmosphere in the executive suite had completely transformed over the past 6 months. The suffocating tension, the intense paranoia, and the constant chaotic financial drama my sons had brought into this building were entirely eradicated. I looked around the large, brightly lit room and felt a profound sense of genuine, hard-earned pride. The heavy leather chairs that Deon and Corey used to occupy places where they would arrogantly check their mobile phones and openly mock senior staff members were now filled with people who actually deserved to sit at the table. I had spent the last half year completely restructuring the entire corporate hierarchy from the ground up. I systematically and ruthlessly purged the company of every single incompetent frat brother, lazy country club friend, and yes-man Deon had ever hired. I permanently dismantled the toxic, suffocating culture of nepotism that had nearly bankrupted my life's work. In their place, I promoted the hardest working, most ethical, and fiercely intelligent individuals within the organization. Sitting directly to my right was a brilliant 32-year-old woman named Sarah. She had started working on our massive loading docks when she was 18, driving heavy machinery to pay her way through night school to earn her degree in advanced supply chain management. Under Deon's incredibly biased leadership, she had been repeatedly passed over for major promotions because she did not possess the right pedigree or elite social connections. Today, she was sitting confidently in Deon's former seat as the newly appointed vice president of global operations. Sitting to my left was Marcus, a former long-haul truck driver who knew every single logistical shipping route on the eastern seaboard significantly better than any expensive automated computer algorithm. He was now our director of fleet logistics. These were men and women who possessed thick calluses on their hands and unwavering integrity in their hearts. They understood the true, foundational value of a dollar because they had literally bled for it, exactly like I had when I started this company. The financial results of this massive structural purge were absolutely undeniable. Without my sons constantly bleeding the corporate accounts dry to fund their secret gambling debts and offshore shell companies, our quarterly profit margins had skyrocketed. Institutional investors who had panicked and fled during the initial federal investigation had returned in massive droves, deeply impressed by the aggressive, transparent house cleaning I had successfully executed. The stock price was currently soaring higher than it ever had in the entire history of the company. The board of directors was completely united, the thousands of employees were fiercely loyal, and the logistics empire was finally secure. Healing from the severe catastrophic betrayal of your own flesh and blood is never a simple linear process. When you spend 70 years of your life firmly believing that family is the ultimate unbreakable bond, discovering that your own children view you as a disposable financial obstacle fundamentally fractures your soul. There were certainly long, incredibly quiet nights during the first few months when the heavy silence of my massive house felt completely suffocating. I would sit alone in my private study, staring at old photograph albums, looking at faded pictures of Deon and Corey smiling brightly on their childhood bicycles, desperately trying to pinpoint the exact moment the dark rot had infected their hearts. The ultimate realization was a bitter, agonizing pill to swallow. I had to boldly confront my own massive failures as a father. By giving them absolute financial immunity from the harsh consequences of the real world, I had accidentally starved their character. I had unknowingly created the exact sociopathic monsters that eventually tried to eat me alive. But as the long months slowly passed, the suffocating paternal guilt completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, impenetrable tranquility. I realized that a healthy, massive tree simply cannot survive if its primary branches are entirely infected with a deadly, highly contagious disease. Sometimes, to save the strong roots and protect the surrounding forest, you have absolutely no choice but to take a heavy axe and sever the diseased limbs completely. Taking down my sons was the most difficult, heart-wrenching decision of my entire existence, but it was absolutely the most necessary. I had saved thousands of innocent, hardworking employees from sudden catastrophic unemployment. I had fiercely protected my late wife's charitable legacy, and most importantly, I had finally learned to protect myself. The heavy, exhausting burden of constantly cleaning up my son's disastrous, criminal mistakes was permanently lifted from my shoulders. I was finally breathing freely for the very first time in over 2 decades. Later that evening, my private driver pulled the armored Maybach smoothly through the towering wrought iron gates of my Atlanta estate. The massive property had never actually been demolished. The court-ordered eviction notice and the roaring yellow bulldozer in the driveway had been a highly orchestrated, perfectly executed legal bluff designed specifically to physically terrify Megan and Abigail off my property without initiating a drawn-out, highly publicized police standoff. I had simply transferred the deed to a secure private shell company I fully controlled entirely, protecting the physical property from the sweeping federal seizure warrants that permanently stripped my sons of everything they owned. I walked through the grand mahogany front doors, taking a deep breath to enjoy the pristine, untouched beauty of the silent marble foyer. Sylvia's antique silver tea set was sitting exactly where it belonged, on the polished dining room table safe from the auction block. I walked over to the marble entryway console where my loyal housekeeper had neatly stacked the day's mail on a silver tray. At the very top of the tidy pile was a plain, incredibly cheap white paper envelope. I picked it up and stared at the return address stamped in bold, sterile black ink in the upper left corner. It was officially marked from the United States Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta. The cramped handwriting in the center of the envelope was erratic, highly desperate, and deeply familiar. It was from Deon. He was undoubtedly begging me to hire him a high-priced appellate lawyer, begging for a monthly prison commissary allowance, or perhaps attempting to spin another elaborate, tear-soaked web of lies to secure my ultimate forgiveness. I stood there in the quiet hallway, feeling the thin, cheap paper resting between my fingers. I did not feel a single ounce of curiosity, love, or pity. I walked slowly down the hall into my private study, stepped directly up to the heavy, industrial-grade paper shredder sitting beside my oak desk, and turned the power switch on. The machine roared to life with a loud, aggressive hum. Without breaking the seal, without reading a single desperate, manipulative word my oldest son had written, I dropped the envelope directly into the sharp steel blades. The machine violently consumed the letter in seconds, permanently turning his empty pleas into tiny, meaningless strips of garbage. Some doors, once they are violently forced shut by betrayal, must remain permanently locked forever. The silence that settled over my life in the following weeks was not empty or isolating. It was profound, incredibly heavy with the weight of absolute, hard-earned peace. It was the specific kind of tranquility you only experience after surviving a massive, devastating storm that washes away all the dead wood. On a crisp, beautifully clear Tuesday morning, I told my private security team to stand down and gave my driver the day off. I drove myself in an understated, unassuming sedan to the quiet, rolling green hills of the historic Oakland Cemetery. The ancient oak trees provided a thick, comforting canopy of shade as I walked slowly down the familiar cobblestone path. I held a large, vibrant bouquet of fresh yellow roses in my right hand. They were Sylvia's absolute favorite flowers. She always used to tell me that they looked like captured drops of pure sunlight. I reached the crest of the hill where her elegant white marble headstone stood, perfectly maintained and overlooking the quiet, sprawling city below. I knelt down slowly, feeling the damp morning grass seep through the knees of my tailored trousers. I gently placed the bright yellow roses against the cold, carved marble of her name. For the very first time in over a decade, I did not feel the heavy, suffocating anxiety of our son's constant failures pressing down on my chest when I visited her resting place. The air was entirely still, and my mind was finally beautifully clear. I rested my bare hand on the top of her headstone, the marble cool and solid beneath my palm. I spoke aloud to her, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of sorrow or regret. I told my beautiful wife that the massive empire we built together from absolute scratch was finally safe. I explained the brutal, agonizing, and highly necessary steps I had to take over the past year to secure our true legacy. I did not sugarcoat the terrifying reality of what happened to Deon and Corey. I told her exactly where they were, exactly what they had attempted to do to my brain, and exactly why they had to be locked away in federal prison. I explained how the parasitic entities that had aggressively attached themselves to our family tree had been entirely removed, roots and all. The massive wealth we bled for was no longer being drained to fund secret offshore bank accounts or massive underground gambling debts. The ruthless predators wearing tailored suits and designer dresses were permanently gone. In their place, our company was thriving under the guidance of young, brilliant, highly ethical minds who respected the immense gravity of honest hard work. I told Sylvia about Sarah and Marcus, the new executive leaders who reminded me so much of us when we first started out with nothing but a single rusted delivery truck and a shared, desperate dream. I assured her that the Sylvia Cole Charitable Trust was fully funded with the $50 million Deon had foolishly tried to steal. I smiled as I told her that the stolen money was already breaking ground on 3 brand new pediatric clinics in the exact same impoverished neighborhoods where we had grown up with nothing. Our legacy was no longer tied to the miserable, arrogant men our sons had chosen to become. Our legacy was now permanently anchored in the thousands of innocent lives those medical clinics would save, and the thousands of hardworking families our thriving logistics company continued to support. I felt a gentle, warm breeze brush past my face, rustling the green leaves of the old oak trees above. It felt exactly like her gentle, approving touch. I spent another hour sitting on the soft grass, simply talking to her about the changing seasons, the quiet mornings in the estate, and the sheer, overwhelming relief of waking up without a sense of impending financial doom. I did not ask for her forgiveness for destroying our children, because deep down I knew she completely understood the grim necessity of my actions. She was a fiercely protective mother, but she was also a woman of absolute, uncompromising integrity. She would have never allowed 2 sociopathic criminals to completely destroy the incredible life we built, regardless of whether or not they shared our biological DNA. We had spent our entire youth fighting tooth and nail to build a massive fortress to protect our family from the harsh world. I simply had to lock the heavy iron gates when I realized the absolute greatest threat to our survival was already living comfortably inside the walls. For most of my 70 years on this earth, I operated under the fundamental, highly flawed assumption that biological family was a sacred, unbreakable bond. I had been heavily conditioned by society and by my own desperate desire to be a good father to believe that absolute, unconditional love meant providing absolute, unconditional financial bailouts. I mistakenly thought my immense accumulated wealth was a magical shield that could permanently protect my sons from their own horrific character flaws. But the brutal, undeniable reality I learned in the twilight of my life is that family is absolutely not defined by shared blood or a shared last name. True family is defined entirely by mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and reciprocal care. Blood simply makes you related. Unwavering loyalty is what actually makes you family. I spent decades sacrificing my own peace of mind, my own physical health, and my own ethical boundaries to constantly save 2 men who secretly wished I was dead so they could steal my wallet. I had normalized their extreme financial and emotional abuse simply because they called me dad. The ultimate most valuable lesson I learned from this terrifying ordeal is that self-sacrifice should never under any circumstances lead to total self-destruction. There is absolutely no honor in setting yourself on fire simply to keep incredibly selfish, parasitic people warm. I finally learned how to establish an ironclad boundary. I finally learned how to fiercely protect myself not just from ruthless corporate rivals on Wall Street, but from the emotional vampires living inside my own home. My ultimate survival depended entirely on my willingness to step aside and let them face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of their own malicious choices. I stood up, brushing the stray blades of green grass from my trousers, and touched the cold marble headstone one final time. I whispered a quiet, peaceful goodbye, turned my back to the grave, and walked steadily down the hill without looking back, a single time. 2 days later, a sleek black car pulled up to a highly exclusive private maritime terminal in the sun-drenched port of Miami. I stepped out onto the warm concrete wearing a comfortable linen shirt, tailored trousers, and carrying absolutely nothing but a single, incredibly small leather duffel bag. I did not need massive trunks of designer clothes, complicated corporate itineraries, or an entourage of nervous executive assistants trailing behind me. I walked lightly up the carpeted ramp toward the gleaming white hull of a brand-new ultra-luxury cruise liner. This magnificent ship was completely different from the massive, crowded commercial vessel where my sons had foolishly attempted to abandon me months ago. This was an intimate, highly exclusive residential ship specifically designed for endless global travel and absolute privacy. A uniformed officer stood at the entrance of the grand foyer, his posture perfect. The seasoned captain of the vessel stepped forward, extending a warm, highly respectful hand. He smiled broadly and said, "Welcome aboard for your world tour, Mr. Cole." I shook his hand firmly, returning the genuine smile. I walked past the incredibly lavish, quiet lobby and stepped directly out onto the expansive rear observation deck. I leaned against the polished mahogany railing and looked out at the vast, glittering expanse of the endless blue ocean stretching out before me. There were no corporate emergencies waiting for me back in Atlanta. There were no greedy children plotting in the shadows to steal my wealth. There were no heavy, exhausting burdens left to carry on my shoulders. The massive ship blasted its deep horn and slowly began to pull away from the dock, gliding smoothly toward the open, limitless horizon. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely, absolutely free. The final lesson I carry with me is that wealth is merely a magnifying glass. It does not create character. It only exposes what is already hidden beneath the surface. I gave my sons everything money could buy, but I failed to give them the struggle required to build a soul. True power is not found in bank accounts or corporate titles. It is found in the absolute courage to walk away from toxicity, even when it shares your bloodline. If this story resonated with you today, please leave a comment below, hit the like button, and subscribe for more.